Welcome back to day 2 of ECOWind and ECOFlow annual impact meeting. I hope you had a good night. Many of you will have got caught in snow on the way in, not too wet. Today's our policy day. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm obviously not Dick and Hal. I'm Steve Gibson. I'm the Director of Strategy at Marine Consulting. Dick's been unavoidably detained and sends his apologies, although I do know he's online listening in. So I'm going to do the housekeeping first, actually, and then I'll just give some reflections from yesterday to remind those who were here and anybody new. It won't do harm to hear those. So there will be a mid-morning break between the 2 sessions that we've got this morning. Lunch is at 12:40 until 1:25, which is a very precise time, because we need the room for another meeting. And if you could have your posters down by the end of lunch as well, it'd be massively helpful. Thank you. And the event will then end over that lunch, and most of you will be leaving. We're live streaming throughout the day, and hopefully we will avoid technical gremlins that we had yesterday, but I may just have cursed it. Thank you to everybody who spoke yesterday, who stuck to time. If we could do the same again today, then we'll get the opportunity for breaks and lunch and the conversations that need to happen. So it worked brilliant yesterday, and the same today will be much appreciated. Thank you. We're having slightly different audio arrangements to deal with some of the challenges we had yesterday. So people online can only hear things that go through a microphone. There was problems yesterday with the roving mics and speakers having to repeat. So what we're going to do is, if you've got a question, you're going to be invited to come down to this microphone here and ask your question there. If there's a question online, we'll talk about it. We'll speak it from the box at the back, but speakers do not then need to repeat the questions. So we will hopefully be slightly swifter through the questions as well. Any logistical technical questions, Paul and Amy at the back, if you're on Zoom, waving. If you're on Zoom, stick them in the chat, of course. And I think in that case, just a quick recap of the reflections that Colin and I gave yesterday. So Colin, looking surprised, yes, talking about you. So Colin talked about the 21 key messages we've had already from the PIs. And this is the only the mid-year, remember? So there's 21 key nuggets, key outcomes that are going to form the basis of going forward. We're all looking for deployment of offshore wind to be done to the best available science, and we've made huge progress. You've all made huge progress in the last 2 years. It's fantastic. We much better understand climate change effects on ocean processes in the relevant areas, and also understanding much more about offshore wind deployment and what changes that causes to ocean processes and to biological systems. We are doing the science to combine those two with other human activities in those sea areas, and we have the basis here for a journey towards supporting decisions for offshore wind deployment in the future. So tomorrow, it says tomorrow here because it was tomorrow. Today is about developing that last conversation further. How are we going to get that support out to our colleagues who make policy and operational and deployment decisions? And we'll be hearing from them today. So usual rules apply. If you've got questions, please ask them with both curiosity and kindness. And I think, unless Paul's shaking his head, I have covered everything. And in which case, I'll invite to the stage Gabriella Gilks from Crown Estate, who's the Senior Research and Evidence Manager for our keynote speech. Gabriella.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm so cheered to see on day 2 that so many of us have braved snow and are here today. So thank you for being here and online. So I'm going to talk a little bit to the importance of research and evidence on the road to net zero today. The Crown Estate is a company for the country. We manage a diverse portfolio across land and sea with the responsibility to unlock value for the nation and return our net profit to the government for the benefit of UK citizens. We're also focused on supporting net zero and energy security for the UK, helping restore our marine environment, and we create thriving coastal communities. For more than 260 years, we've managed the seabed around England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and half the foreshore. And this includes responsibility for 27 marine sectors, which include things like offshore renewable energy, marine aggregates, carbon capture and storage. And this allows us to take a long-term view. So I'm going to remind us that back in 1760, the global population was just 800 million. During the 260 years, the Industrial Revolution happened, human population increased tenfold, and we pumped an estimated 1.5 trillion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In the mid-1850s, Eunice Newton-Foote, an amateur scientist, completed her experiment examining the warming effects on two jars, one containing carbon dioxide and one containing air. By the middle of the 20th century, atmospheric science was in full swing and the term climate crisis was widely in use. 25 years ago, the first offshore wind turbines began operating in the sea off Northumberland. And then between 2008 and 2019, the UK passed its first legislation, first to reduce emissions and then actually to set targets for net zero. Fast forward to today, and the seabed holds the potential to unlock some of the greatest challenges of our time, reversing the decline of the natural environment, addressing climate change, offering us energy security, and stimulating growth and regeneration through new jobs. But the demands being placed on it continue to grow at an ever-increasing rate. So to address these challenges faster than ever before, we need a whole system approach. And in our team at the Crown Estate, we hold responsibility for overseeing our long-term strategic approach to marine research, evidence, and spatial planning. We work with organisations, many of you here in the room today, such as the UK devolved governments, research councils, academic centres of excellence, industry, and various bodies to identify evidence gaps and horizon scan future themes in the marine space. Working together, we develop large-scale programs, digital tools, and platforms that address some of these critical marine issues. And in doing this work, we strive to develop the UK's reputation for research excellence in offshore industry. To prevent that overwhelm we talked about yesterday of feeling we should do everything everywhere all at once, we earlier this year brought out our marine delivery route map. And in our team, Research and Evidence, we use this as to focus where we should be doing things at what time and in what space. So that ecosystem, which I spoke about, this is what it looks like. And just to spotlight a few areas. So starting with the top, digital platforms, the Marine Data Exchange. Many of you here in the room are familiar with it. It's been running since 2013, contains over 3,000 data points, and is the world-leading gold standard in the open sourcing of industry survey data. I'm extremely proud that we can help the UK really lead the way here, and it's a privilege for us to be able to host this platform. I know that many of us in the room input to or make use of the data. Back to the ecosystem, and in the middle section here, these are our flagship evidence and change programs, such as those we're talking about today in partnership with NERC, and then the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change program in partnership with DESNZ and DEFRA. And with these projects, we're really trying to understand, minimize and mitigate impacts of offshore industry, shorten consenting time, and close evidence gaps and share best practice. But with all this information, we really need to know how to apply it. And each marine sector can't plan its future in isolation without thinking about the other users of the sea, including how to integrate competing and complementary interests. So this all comes together in our Whole of Seabed programme, which develops a leading evidence base on the future use of UK waters with underlying spatial analysis capability. We use innovative GIS processes to model a number of scenarios, such as the one that you're seeing here, which help us understand the many different ways that we can develop the seabed out to 2050 and beyond, helping the UK deliver a sustainable, resilient and decarbonised future. Working across sectors that we have responsibility for, together with partners in sectors beyond our jurisdiction, such as defence, shipping, fisheries, etc., we work to understand the parameters in creating our scenarios, considering livelihood, user safety, and minimising disruption within the models. Using various tools such as our research optimization and identification and multi-criteria analysis or analytical hierarchical processing, we break these considerations down into themes and give these various constraints a series of weighting or prioritization, creating a heat map of pressures. And these modules help us to create branches within the model that allow us to make like-for-like pairwise comparisons. These can help our stakeholders see how their interests are best represented, where a triple SI may be considered alongside Ramsar designation, for instance. And in addition to other variables like safety, cost, water depth, etc., these are all considered in our analysis. Within the whole of seabed, we've developed a unique approach to nature, considering it both as a sensitivity in the deployment of sectors, as well as something considered in its own right, with areas of opportunity for restoration, protection, and enhancement modelled and understood. So it's really here and with this tool, the system within a system, that we can really bring your insights in and apply them. And it's here that we can integrate other tools that have already been developed by people in the room, such as Poseidon, MSpace, etc. And these can add sophistication to our models. We can also incorporate other agencies' spatial planning work, such as that of Emsbury, East Marine Plan, NERAS, and so on. But finally, I want to make the point that we don't just commission research through our formal programmes. My team are constantly looking for ways that we can add insights and further develop our understanding of offshore industry by commissioning surveys and projects to enhance our whole of seabed analysis. Just to give you an example of one in our suite that we've got going on today, and thank you for the slide, but frontward, we're working with some partners to consider the presence of shelf sea fronts and their relationship to biodiversity and how we should consider these as constraints within our whole of seabed model. But really crucially, this ecosystem should be a feedback loop. So we're constantly seeking new evidence and we want to hear what everybody thinks is needed. As an island nation, the UK's fortunes have always been tied to the waters surrounding our shores. Just this last week, we've even received new UK targets to meet in the road to net zero, 81% of emissions reduction by 2035, Collins 50 gigawatts by 2030, and some estimates suggest that as much as 125 gigawatts of offshore renewable energy will be needed in the UK to meet net zero by 2050. Against a backdrop of planetary crisis, shifting baselines, hottest years on record, there's going to be no shortage of work for us to do. But I think our greatest challenge rather, is our greatest opportunity. We need to make the research that you're doing count. And I hope that today I've given you some reassurance that your insights can go to the very heart of our decision-making process. But let's work together, everybody here in the room and online, to identify the various levers that can help this work get into the right place for the right decision at the right time. It's been incredible to witness the trajectory of the ocean in the policy landscape, even within my own career lifespan, from only the briefest mention at the 2015 Paris COP to being truly recognised as a key engine of climate and net zero, and now with its own dedicated UN Ocean Decade, giving us the science we need for the ocean we want. What an extraordinary privilege it is to be here right now at a critical time for the planet within our career spans and the chance to really make a difference. I want to thank you all for your contribution and the impact it can have. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. And Henk, I think this is your session, isn't it?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Gabby, for kicking us off. one of the things that you just raised is about working together. I think that's a really, really important note that I want to pick up on now. So we're just starting our first session of today, a new day. We're pivoting slightly from hearing about the great research that's going on across ECOWind and what will be soon starting in ECOFlow. And today we'll be hearing more about how we can advance marine policy and thinking about strategic evidence and its role in that. So first of all, I'd like us to think about what actually makes up strategic evidence. Started working in this area. The word strategic is one that I didn't quite know how to interpret that because it can go in several different directions. One of the angles, the elements of strategic evidence is that it should operate on a local, but also up to a national scale as well. So local, regional, national, and we heard some of that across all of yesterday's projects. Another element of strategic in its definition is that it applies to not just one need, but many needs at once. It's an all-encompassing idea. So when we're talking about strategic evidence, if we think about this as something that applies quite widely, that can meet many needs at once, and then if we start to ask ourselves, how do we advance marine policy? Now, I asked this question to a lot of folk who are in this room. One of the questions that we were asked yesterday was, who are the right people? Who are the right people to have in that conversation? And yes, many of them are here. And often how this approach works in practice is you get those people together in a room and you start talking. And you start to talk around, what are your challenges? What are your needs? What are the things that aren't working so well? And you move on from that. You begin to understand how those needs can be met. You begin to co-develop solutions. You begin to think of projects, programs like ECOWind and ECOFlow. And you can start to weave these things together. And woven into the DNA of those two research programs, we have a need to develop the right evidence, strategic evidence, that can then be applied to tackle policy challenges that will then advance policy. And we're talking about policies in and around UK marine strategy, OSPAR, the British energy security strategy, and many of those issues we'll hear more about from our 5 speakers now. So this first session, like I said, we're moving on. We're going to hear a little bit more about other elements in this important conversation. And to kick us off, I'd like to welcome Victoria Metheringham from DEFRA, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about some of those evidence needs and some of the challenges going on in DEFRA.
Get the slide moving. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Change your pointer at the top if you need.
Okay, thanks. Hi, good morning, everybody. Yes, you just will have seen I'm the first teaching for the day. I'm going to show you the policy cycle, take you back to the basics. But before I do, I'm head of marine biodiversity and environment science monitoring. So my team heads up how we monitor marine biodiversity across multiple policy areas and also any of the strategic evidence gaps that we need filling. And I also just want to say on the agenda, it said we were going to give you a policy update from the Offshore Wind Enabling Actions Programme. I'm sorry, but we don't have one to give you right now, but we will as soon as we get one. We had a new government, and when you get a new government in place, and DEFRA is very big, and we've got lots of things going on in DEFRA at the moment. Our ministers are engaged, and we are working with them, and the policy teams are working with them, and we'll pass on the new policy direction or update as soon as we get one. But at the moment, we're just carrying on. So I'm going to take us back to basics and just show you about how strategic evidence does play a part throughout the policy cycle, that you might not see it on the outside, but evidence is used throughout decision making within DEFRA. And Some of you probably have seen this before back in the day from uni or anything like that. So I know you can't see it in detail, but I'm just going to skim over it. There is a cycle of when you are developing a policy right from the beginning. You're setting the policy agenda right through to it being enacted, to it being in legislation, right through to it being then monitored, and is it working? So there is this continuous cycle for policy. I've added these 6 green boxes. That doesn't mean that evidence is only used 6 times. I've just tried to explain how evidence is used throughout the whole system. So, for example, you need evidence base to get started. So you've identified you need a new policy. What's the evidence base to kick us off? Right at the beginning, you might find out you don't have an evidence base. So you have to set up an evidence program or invest in an external evidence program to help you with that evidence base. What has and hasn't worked before? Is this novel? Is this new? Do we have to do something brand new? Again, do we need to invest in an evidence program? An evidence pack is required for it to get to regulation stage. And within this, there is a very chunky impact assessment. The impact assessment is carried out by the economists. And all the work that we've been doing in the last few years on the Marine Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment Programme has really helped us bulk out these evidence packs. It's helped us speak that language to the decision makers, to the people with the money, to Treasury, and to the ministers and legal. So there is this cross-cutting theme of trying to bring all of this together to move us into this ecosystem approach, which we want to move towards. Evidence is needed throughout. We need to know how to implement it. It's socio-economic and environmental. How do we measure success? What does that look like? And then there's the monitoring. It's out there. We've got the intervention set up. Is it working? And if it isn't, how do we assess it? And then if it's not working or something else has come in that we weren't expecting, you start the cycle again. So how do we identify gaps we need to fill? So I know a lot of people say, well, you've got the evidence, can't you just get on with it now? Well, there's 3 pillars around how you create policy, and they're fairly, well, sometimes some of them are much bigger than others. So we've got the politics, the evidence, and the delivery side, and each of these, it can impact on each other. We could have tons of evidence, but we don't have the political steer or direction. We could have the evidence and the political steer, but we haven't figured out how it's deliverable yet. So we have all of these linkages right across. So when policy is being developed, it's very, very rare that one policy option is put forward. Numerous policy areas are identified, which is why I think some of you were mentioning yesterday, what if you find out that something isn't working or something isn't good or something isn't going the way that we want it to? We need that information because we're like, okay, that option is closed off. So this gives us more weight to consider these other options. So knowing what doesn't work is needed as much as what does work. That just is around the table, all the different people. You have the experts, delivery partners, end users, the statisticians, socio-economic, science, legal, all of these people to create this policy. So you have this new policy and we've got the direction for it from the ministers, and we're like, okay, this is our desired future of where we want to get to. But right now we're on the track of this predicted future, and that space in between is the policy gap. And it might be not one policy gap. We might identify, for us to deliver this policy, we actually need to set up some other policies in between. And that's where we find gaps. And this is where we're moving to this strategic space to try and say, okay, we can't keep looking at one policy area on its own in isolation. There's too many gaps, but cross-cutting evidence throughout. So how do we get all of these? If you think about all of the policy cycle at the beginning, they're all moving at different speeds. You think of them as wheels. And they're all moving at different speeds, and it's really difficult for them to talk to each other. So they're already under their own pressures to deliver their policy, and they've got to consider these other policies as well. So I'd say the rod that's cross-cutting throughout these wheels, this is the evidence. So this is where we're trying to move to with our strategic evidence and monitoring, so that when we're looking at what's putting out, what delivery partners are doing, what research is going on externally, that this is answering multiple questions for us. So again, just go back to some basics now on, I'd say like the bread and butter, the core stuff that's in marine and fisheries, which we need to consider across every single policy area, irrespective of what it's called. So remember the 25-year environment plan? I was trying to remember off the top of my head what year this was. Is it 2018, 2017? Somewhere around there anyway. We had the 25-year environment plan and it was cross-party agreed, House of Commons and House of Lords. And it was running for a few years and we had an internal review and it just wasn't delivering. We weren't getting there. We weren't having the interventions in place. And one of the ways that we initially measure whether or not something is working is what actions have been put in place, how much money we're spending on it. And it just didn't have the oomph it needed. So that policy cycle restarted. Why isn't the 25-year environment plan making the impact we want to? And it was identified it needed a legislative driver. So the Environment Act 2021 gave legally binding environment targets. It gave the 25-year environment plan the teeth and the kick that it needed to be able to start meeting these targets. And in the environmental impact plan, they just pulled out some very quick things. You can see the fisheries management plans on there, and it mentions about managing stocks, but to take into the wider context of the ecosystem and the UK marine strategy, and we'd never done this before. Marine natural capital is in there as well. So us developing tools to help us tell that story better to the people who make the decisions, to help us represent the importance of this ecosystem approach. And then there's the offshore wind part, which is in the EIP as well. And it's just that last sentence there, that DEFRA has a very specific role. Yes, they have the Department of Energy and Net Zero, and they have the ultimate targets around the delivery of the energy, the uplift for energy. But for DEFRA's side of things is we want the development to happen and we need it to happen alongside protection of the ocean and support for its recovery. So again, it's just looking at the whole picture. Now to quickly move on, we've got the UK Marine Strategy there. I'm not going to dwell on it. You know all about the UK Marine Strategy. So this is cross-cutting throughout, and of course OSPAR. And then just quickly mentioning the Fisheries Act. I know my colleagues that worked on this are very, very proud of it because right at the beginning of the Fisheries Act, and again, this had never happened before, instead of us just looking at fisheries in isolation, we have these objectives now that we look at fisheries in alongside with, and we've got scientific evidence objective, ecosystem objective, and the climate change objective are all in there. So this is us moving to this systems level. So as much as we want to look at the evidence at the ecosystem level on the outside, we've recognised we need to be working at this systems level on the inside. And I think I've explained that throughout what I've already been talking about. But really, through the mapping of these interconnections of these different policy areas, we can begin to anticipate impacts, see feedback loops, negative and positive, and understand how the system might respond. If we're putting all of these activities in this space, it's going to push out those activities that are already happening. And what will that mean? What will that look like? So that's the whole picture. And again, a shout out to our brilliant MNCA programme that have helped us really move to this space of applying systems approach to how we deal with strategic evidence and how that influences policy. So the key messages that I wanted to get across today was that DEFRA will continue to work with external research communities and academia to bring to evidence into the most relevant policy areas at the right time. I think similar to what Gabriella was said, at the right time. And there is some work that we can do on our side to help communicate with you what impact that you're having. And that is something that we're looking at, trying to get better out so we can get those messages out to you. You are making a difference, and here is where you're making a difference. We are building our strategic evidence plans alongside external research. So when we're identifying we're in this predicted future, we have this desired future, and we've got all of these gaps where we're looking where to put our efforts for in-house work that we need to do. We're looking, what's ECOWind doing? We're taking this into account. What has SMMR already delivered? We're taking these things into account while we were looking where we're going to spend our budget internally. And I just wanted to also shout out, I can't talk about it right now because it's ongoing and it is official sensitive, but I can tell you that DEFRA Science has been actively utilising and relying on evidence provided and currently being developed as part of the ECOWind programme. You are helping us with something really difficult right now, and we can't wait to tell you about it once I can tell you about it. But I just want you to know that well, ultimately, I think it's summed up in the last slide, and that is, I want to DEFRA wants to say thank you. We really value the knowledge and the expertise that you were bringing to the rapidly developing policy area, to the industry, and to assist with the goals for the environment. Thank you for this network that you've built. It's absolutely brilliant. It's just wonderful when I come to these events, all of the sharing that goes on, and also the building of existing work across programs that have already been and gone. There's a constant question that we have to answer of value for money, and what about that and the legacy of this? So just seeing the thread of work that has been before being pulled across is fantastic. So thank you, and that's me.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you also for for sharing about how the ECOWind research is already being considered and used, and it stresses the importance of continuing those conversations there and sharing our latest findings and working with our colleagues across all the different sectors to move that forward. So that's really great to hear. Thank you. We're going to hear now from Tristan Bromley from the Crown Estate. And Tristan's going to talk to us about the whole of seabed program, which is a huge strategic initiative that looks to consider all matters, locations of different industries, sectors and activities at sea. He hasn't got long to tell us about all of that, but he's very practiced at this, and I'm sure you're going to hear the best of it just next. So welcome you to the stage, please, Tristan.
Morning, everybody. So yeah, as Hank was saying, I'm Tristan Bromley. I work at the Crown Estate in our spatial planning team, and I lead what we call our whole of seabed program. So Gabby's earlier set the scene in terms of what we do at the Crown Estate with our data and evidence, talking a bit within that to what we then have within our whole of seabed capability, some of the tools we use, and the high level context around that. What I'm going to use the next 8 minutes to do is to give a quick recap of what we look at in this evidence program in a bit more detail, and then try and outline where that fits back in to the policy landscape, how it interfaces and how it informs the wider delivery that we look at in the Crown Estate. So yeah, so to recap on the program, what is the whole of seabed program? So it is primarily a program of evidence development and in turn developing the underlying analytical capability and tools we need in order to create that evidence. And that roughly falls into two parts. Firstly, looking at where we think the best potential areas of opportunity for all of the different sectors that we manage as the Crown Estate, so everything from aggregates to telecoms to offshore wind, and as Gabby was saying earlier, nature as well, both in its own right and how it acts as a sensitivity to the development of other sectors. And we look at developing these spatial maps of where we think those resources are based on considering where, if we used offshore wind as an example, what we think the best natural resources are for it. So things like water depth, sediment type, etc. Where is it windy? Looking at the barriers to where we can't deploy that technology. So for example, highly protected marine areas, generally where we have either a legal restriction or there is existing infrastructure. Then looking at other interests, so essentially everything else that is going on across our seas, whether that is fishing activity, shipping, the rest of the MPA network and the designations, and using our hierarchical processing to weigh up those data sets against each other and create those heat maps of where we think is better and worse on that basis, and then considering cost as well. The second part of that, once we have all of these different maps of where we think those potential areas are, is looking at how do we think that seabed might be used out to 2050 in the context of trying to achieve net zero, trying to support nature recovery, trying to support the wider marine economy and thriving communities. And in order to do that, we conduct scenario analysis on how we think those different areas of seabed could be used according to different policy drivers, different potential futures The idea being that we produce this evidence base of different scenarios with that underlying understanding of the resource. And we can use that to clarify where we think the key challenges might be out to 2050 in terms of then delivering against those really chunky policy goals and working with others to work out how we can best navigate those processes over the next 25 years. So to move on and then place it back in the context of policy. So we can see on this slide that the whole of seabed programme sits in that evidence-based box. It sits in that wider context of increasing demand for marine space, that spatial squeeze, the drivers around biodiversity loss and needing to support nature recovery, and that driver of net zero. And really the key tool or programme that whole of seabed interfaces in within the Crown Estate is what we call our Marine Delivery Route Map, which is a collaborative initiative and essentially a long-term strategy for how we use our data and evidence and plan for delivery over the coming decades, how we ultimately meet those policy goals through delivering through our management of the seabed. Within that delivery route map, we work to coordinate with other agencies around those policy challenges. And the key interface with whole of seabed is using that scenario analysis to plan around forward management and developing these spatial pathways, essentially trying to work out where do we think the more central cases are in terms of how the seabed might be used, and giving us that framework and evidence base to really ground some of the discussions we have in the policy space in that data and evidence. Finally, what we can then do once we have established where those challenges are and what we think our best understanding and cut of the evidence base is at a given point in time, we can then use that to provide hopefully greater visibility to delivery over the next 25 years. For example, to things like how we invest in supply chains in order to enable those outcomes. What I then thought I would do is then try and zoom out a bit and really start thinking about, we have this coordinating mechanism of the route map, we have our whole of seabed evidence base which fits into that, but what are some of the sort of tricky challenges around that in terms of how we make that evidence impactful through the route map and within that wider ecosystem of policy and with different agencies and delivery partners. So firstly, I think we have this general challenge, hence reference the breadth of what we look at in whole of seabed. And it really is broad. To date, we've looked across 10 sectors in detail. There are clearly more that we could look at. There is always that drive to prioritize where do we think we can add most value through the next iteration of our work, through the long-term development of our work. How do we sequence it? How do we identify those evidence priorities and work with others, making sure that we know everything else that is going on and being driven by other evidence programs, and how do we synthesize all of that? Secondly, we then need to balance those drivers of evidence development with drivers of policy and decisions. So quite similar to what Victoria was talking about, essentially thinking about that policy cycle of the policies that we know are in development. What stage are they essentially in that policy cycle? Where are the key decisions that might be made and may come looking for evidence to inform them? How do we best coordinate and essentially work with government and other bodies to make sure that we are prioritizing in the right way? So those first two are really closely interlinked. And then finally, I think it's worth always coming back to making sure that the value of what that specific evidence is bringing, either to a specific decision or a specific program, what role is that evidence playing? Why are we looking at this particular piece of evidence as opposed to another? What weight should it hold in relation to everything else? And making sure that people understand all of those caveats around the usage, what it does do, what it doesn't do, and how we need to contextualize it amongst everything else that is going on in a really busy research environment and a really busy policy space with lots going on, lots changing within that broader context we're all working in. And then finally, to sort of bring it back to the whole of seabed programme itself, so where are we now with the development of this? So as I've referenced, the whole of seabed programme, it's an iterative initiative and it is one for the long term. What we are really looking to do is take this initial programme of evidence development and developing this concept of what do we mean by a whole of seabed approach, and really embed that within our ways of working within the Crown Estate and within those wider systems. So at the moment, we're basically working through our second iteration of updating our resource areas over the next couple of months into the spring, and broadly looking to get our next cut of those resource areas around that time next year, which can then in turn start to inform further scenario analysis. It's always a bit of a balance of when we basically iterate and draw out a new version of those resource areas, because this is truly a long-term and ongoing process, but we always want something current to be able to essentially have off the shelf in that sense. So really the key point here is that we want our processes to keep evolving over time within this. There will always be new policies, new initiatives, new evidence to take account of and think about how that interfaces with our whole of seabed programme, how we can make best use of it, and how we can then feed that back through into our delivery route map into that wider policy space. So I'll leave you with that in terms of what we really want to think about with the whole of seabed programme is over the next year or so is how do we keep embedding and developing this evidence and capability into our ways of working and make sure that we get best value out of it within the policy cycles and policy contexts we work in. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. I can think of a few great maps I saw yesterday that you might be interested in weaving into the whole of seabed programme at some point. We're going to pivot a little bit now to talk about one of the main challenges, one of the main consenting challenges to the rollout of offshore wind, and that is in and around ornithological impacts. So we're going to hear from Alex Banks from Natural England, who's going to talk to us a little bit about evidence in this space and ways in which we can develop better new evidence approaches and feed that in to make an effect in this policy area. So welcome, Alex, to the stage.
Morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm Alex. I'm Principal Specialist for Ornithology with Natural England. We're the Nature Conservation Advisor in England. So what I'm talking about predominantly does pertain to England, but there will be some relevance to the other UK countries as well. So I'm going to give a bit of a forward look to what's coming down the track in terms of strategic evidence and how we hope that will change the way that we do some of the impact assessment around ornithology. So I won't labour the point about issues with seabirds. I think most people are familiar. They're susceptible to collision potentially and to displacement from the water. And we have collected a lot of evidence over the last 20 years on the potential impacts to seabirds. But as Rachel Mills was saying yesterday, we maybe haven't moved the dial quite as far as we might have hoped in that time. The challenge for people like Natural England is to kind of use all of that evidence that's generated and turn that into best practice. And what this best practice does is kind of take an evidence-based approach to how we should do things like impact assessment that make them compliant with the legislation that we have to fit within. And this best practice is all freely available. And we're always kind of trying to respond to new evidence being generated so that our best practice can remain up to date. And we are trying to move to more of a strategic approach with some of the advice that we provide. In pursuit of this phrase at the bottom of the screen there, that's our vision from Natural England's approach to offshore wind, which was published a few years ago and encapsulated by our chair, Tony Juniper, who described it as high nature, low carbon. So that's what we're aiming for. And most of what we do is through the prism of the mitigation hierarchy, which is probably familiar to most people, this very simplified version of it. You start at the bottom of the pyramid trying to avoid impact, then you move up. Anything you can't avoid, you try to mitigate. Anything you can't mitigate, you then need to compensate. And now we have net gain at the top of that pyramid. And all of our advice within this kind of approach is underpinned by evidence. And that big green triangle with all that evidence is everything all of you guys are doing, all of the fantastic science that's happening. The challenge for us is trying to understand what all of that means, interpret it, and formulate it into this best practice. And that best practice is then used for impact assessment, both at the strategic level, so both at the plan level, which is where we're trying to get to more of, as well as the project level. And as I say, the aspiration is to do more and more at the strategic level, so there are fewer issues for projects specifically to pick up. So we are trying to approach that mitigation hierarchy by leading some pieces of work. And this is one of them. So Gabriella mentioned Poseidon and the work we're doing with the Crown Estates. This is funded by the OEC project. Just for Josh, it's a slightly tenuous acronym, Planning Offshore Wind Strategic Environment Impact Decision ONS. And the aim of the project is to generate these integrated risk maps across the whole of the UK EEZ. We're doing that by collating existing data. We've got over 3 million kilometers of transect data for birds and seabirds, as well as a big data processing. And we have collected new data in the far southwest and the far northeast, as well as to the east of Shetland. So it's been a big data exercise to bring all this stuff together. And that's all being fed into new predictive models. So we'll have distribution models for 27 seabird species for each month around the whole UK EEZ, and the same for 12 marine mammal species, as well as benthic communities and habitats. And I guess what Poseidon does for the first time is try to bring these three elements together so we can understand risk to those distributions from their sensitivity to pressures from offshore wind. And we're going to be bringing those together into one risk map so you can see environmental risk without needing to kind of interrogate the layers. But of course, you can do that. So you can look at risk at different scales. All of this stuff is due to deliver next summer. So it's very imminent. As Gabriella says, we're working with the whole of seabed approach to try and feed that into marine planning so that we can be clear about where environmental risk is right from the outset of planning new offshore wind farms. And we're thinking hard about what it means for things like baseline characterization. So at the moment, there's a demand for 24 months of baseline characterization for each new project, which means a dedicated period of time by which projects have to collect data. What we hope to do with Poseidon is change some of that. So with our new understanding of distribution, which also comes with confidence, we'll be able to see where we have less confidence in our predictions of distribution and therefore where we might need to target new strategic data collection rather than a very specific 24-month data campaign for each project. And it could mean that for projects, we could move to a much more bespoke system of baseline data to fill the gaps in what Poseidon already tells us. And we'll also be thinking very hard over the next 12 months or so about how we can use tools from Poseidon within impact assessment itself. So all of this stuff will be made available through the Marine Data Exchange in a specific Poseidon viewer, freely available to everybody to use. So that's how we're planning to tackle that avoidance part. And then what we're thinking about in terms of mitigation is another OEC funded project. I'd say a slightly less tenuous acronym, RESCUE. This is reducing seabird collisions using evidence. And how we're approaching this is to try and finally accurately describe seabird flight height. So there's obviously a trade-off between the height of the blades above the sea surface and the amount of collisions that potentially causes with birds. And obviously the greater the gap, theoretically, the less collisions you should have. Within this project, we're testing technologies like LiDAR carried by aircraft, like laser rangefinders, which are handheld devices to estimate the heights of objects, and through GPS telemetry to formulate a shared database of seabird flight height data. And we're also producing standards about how these data methods should be used. So everybody can collect data to common standards to feed into this database and therefore keep that strategic evidence topped up and current. What we hope this will do is move us towards more off-the-shelf mitigation solutions. So if we can understand seabird flight height accurately, we can then feed that into cost-benefit models, which tell us for every meter of height above the sea you raise a blade, how much collision you might reduce, but also the implications for energy production and for cost. And although the final tools won't be ready until 2027, there are some of the products made available as they kind of come to fruition, including those standards in data collection, which should be available in the next few months. Then the final part of the hierarchy, compensation. Natural England was commissioned by DEFRA to make recommendations that formed this piece of work called the English Seabird Conservation and Recovery Pathway, or ESCARP for short. This is 19 recommendations containing 74 actions that are effectively a kind of handbook for recovery for seabirds in England. And we're working with DEFRA and RSPB and other partners to see how we can knit together the aims of the recovery pathway with some of the requirements for offshore wind compensatory measures. And in doing so, hopefully we can, I was going to say kill two birds with one stone, but obviously, I mean, whatever the opposite of that is. Anyway, hopefully that will create a better and more efficient system for us to deliver compensation. The final thing we're working on is called ALSAT. It's a tool which brings together information for impact assessment. So there's another piece of work called Cumulative Effects Framework, which is putting together all of the tools that we use for impact assessment. And all of those tools have inputs and they have outputs. And what ALSAT will do is bring all those together in one place. So that it's standardized, so that it's iterative, it's transparent, it's flexible. And it means that when we're considering impact assessment, we don't need to go through 10 annexes of an environmental statement. All of the information can be together in one place in this ALSAT tool. And we're starting to work with consultants and developers to see how this might be applied in future offshore wind projects. And then the final kind of plea, I suppose, I would make is that we'd like to change the way that we deal with evidence, because currently, you know, evidence is generated and often it's introduced into examinations, meaning that the statutory bodies like Natural England have to understand that evidence and discuss it and work out the interpretation of it in a live examination, which is a very, often very stressful, but also time-constrained process. And what we'd really like to see is a kind of parallel stream of evidence consideration, where we can form panels or groups across the sector to collaborate to synthesize new evidence. And yes, there will be some arguments, there'll be some disagreements. We're all scientists, there's uncertainty in what we're doing. But we think this would be a much better way to try and lead to consensus or compromise about the interpretation of evidence. Or at very worst, it would allow us to be transparent about why we disagree about evidence. And in that way, we hope that could feed into our best practice guidance in a way which has buy-in from stakeholders, including consultants, developers, and academics, and therefore make the process of impact assessment smoother because there's more agreement on the interpretation of the evidence that goes into the best practice. And in doing so, mean that there's less backwards and forwards within examinations, less contention, and hopefully more streamlined consenting. So yeah, just to summarize, we are actively looking at all of our approaches to offshore wind ornithology impact assessment in a way to try and make it more strategic, more effective and quicker. We really advocate this new collaborative approach. Obviously, we don't have money to pay people to come and be part of that, but we'd hope that if we can get something going, people will kind of buy into it through goodwill and through the pursuit of that kind of better system that we think would result. We are trying to make all of this more strategic and leave fewer issues for project level. And then the final point I'd make, bear us in mind, please. Please work with us so we can understand the fantastic science that you're doing so that we can then apply it into the best practice that we provide advice on, and so that everybody can benefit from the work that you're doing and the evidence that you're generating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. I think you gave us lots of good examples there of where you're able to take evidence, think strategically about it, and then ways of applying that to tackle policy challenges. I really liked your your consenting idea as well, to accelerate consenting. And I think when we hear from John in a few moments, that might be something that might touch on that to some extent. You also spoke a lot about different tools, and I think we can't stress the importance of tools, and a lot of the research projects are working on tools as well, because they are places where we bring all the evidence into one place, and it can be easily accessed. So we're going to hear now from Will Lecan from CFAS, who is going to talk to us about an evidence tool that aims to bring together evidence, fisheries evidence as well, this time, and make that available to tackle some challenging policy areas, right, Will?
Broadly speaking, yes. Thank you, Hank.
Great.
Hi, I'm Will Lecan from CFAS. Now, I have a slight confession. What I've actually done is taken two 15-minute presentations and mashed them into one 10-minute one. So I apologise in advance, but there's some things I wanted to say. The first half is kind of setting out, I guess, a bit of how I would perceive a challenge for the evidence community as a whole. That's the first half, and then the second half, I want to talk a bit about just one of the approaches we have taken in CFAS to kind of work towards this. Because of this, I have to make a lot of simplifications. There are a lot of nuances. I'm just going to bulldoze straight over. So what's the context for all this? We've been talking about wind farms, but actually there's quite a lot more that we want from the sea. We're interested not just about producing energy, it's a sort of transport, food, aggregates, and it's very important to many aspects of society and life. But at the same time, we're very interested in protecting the sea. And we need to balance these things and look at trade-offs between them. So ultimately, you know, what is it that we care about as society as a whole? What is it that we as a nation want? And we need to have concerns about our economy, our society and our communities, and our environment. And to kind of get to this at a national level, we're looking at kind of multidisciplinary integrated evidence on impacts and trade-offs. And trade-offs is critical because it is all about trade-offs. Just focusing in on the environment bit, because that's one of the main things we're talking about here. What is it we care about? What is it we're trying to achieve? There are all these possible impacts. Well, at a global scale, we have the Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets out some quite clear targets for what the world is trying to achieve for the environment. At a regional scale in the Northeast Atlantic, OSPAR sets out a number of commitments and objectives, and at the ministerial level, we've signed up to these. And then more specifically, at the national level, we have the UK Marine Strategy and its objectives for good environmental status, which are basically setting out the goalposts for what we in the UK feel we want to achieve. I'm sure a number of you are aware of the kind of indicators for good environmental status. These are the kind of descriptors. I won't go through them all now. And under them, there are a number of very specific formal indicators that we use at a national scale to see if we're achieving our environmental objectives for the ocean. And we undertake these assessments at a kind of sub-national regional scale. And that is the spatial scale at which we as a country consider whether or not we are achieving our objectives for the seas. So we produce lots of great evidence. There's lots of work being done throughout the scientific community. But quite often we find that our evidence isn't used and brought into kind of decision making and policy development and management decisions. And there was some work done a number of years ago in the States that was looking at this, and they brought forward this concept of credibility, salience, and legitimacy, three of the main barriers to why environmental evidence is not used in decision making. Credibility, is your evidence believable? There are a number of factors behind it, but one of the issues can be what you might call scientific black boxes. If people can't see where the evidence is coming from, tends to lose credibility. Legitimacy, are the right people bringing the right information into a decision-making process at the right time? This is the world of social sciences and the bit I don't really understand. But salience is a key point. Are we asking the right, or addressing the right issues in the right way at the right time? If an assessment is at a North Sea scale and you're talking about Dogger Bank, it's not salient. If the assessment is about the BH3 benthic impacts on the seafloor and you're coming along and talking about the relative benthic status indicator, you're answering the wrong question. If the committee meeting is making their decision on the 4th of April and your report's on the 20th of August, you might as well not have started. So those are barriers. I mean, on top of that, in this complex evidence system, I would also say there is this bit about digestibility. It's really hard to distill down all these complex messages we have into something that people can take on board in a kind of real life decision-making process. And if we're not meeting those 4 criteria, we will find time and time again, we do brilliant science, great papers, and our evidence is not used. So basically, what we need is coordinated, multidisciplinary, accessible and understandable evidence for diverse stakeholders on wind farms at a national scale to see if we're achieving GES. I appreciate the kind of farm level EIA conversation is slightly separate to that. But at a strategic national level, this is the task for us. And if that's not challenging enough, we also need to consider this alongside our other pressures on the system. So, without taking too much longer, we need to coordinate our evidence. We need to bring this to a national and a subnational regional scale. We need to come up with cumulative kind of impact analysis, and we need to go from ecological evaluations to policy analysis. And the point being is translating our R&D outputs to evidence and advice is actually a dedicated task which often gets overlooked. So very quickly, and this is where I'm going to have to start going very rapidly, I can talk at length separately to this. What are some of the ways we can move forward? I think we need the ecosystem approach, but I think we need to deconstruct it to make it comprehensible. We need frameworks for coordinated analysis. How do we bring all this information together in common ways? We need touch points for this integration, and we need to prioritize and simplify. So deconstructing the ecosystem approach, I'm sure you're aware of this concept of management, activity, pressure, and state. I think actually what we should do, well, what an approach we're taking is looking at this, we're separating the pressure and state challenge, whereby you can use one set of tools for short-term tactical evaluations that just look at the management to pressure linkages. And then you can use separate tools for multiple independent analysis of the kind of long-term pressure state ecosystem interactions, rather than building it all into single complicated models. Through that way, you can then bring together multiple models that were used in an integrated analysis without creating a black box, which just scares people. Common touch points, we want to bring together information on fisheries, wind farms, aggregates. This is about kind of agreeing temporal and spatial scales. We've already heard multiple talks this morning, all working at different spatial scales. And oh, look, I'm bringing in another one. Isn't that helpful? We're currently working at 0.05 degrees. And then in that way, you can try and bring together coordinated evidence across multiple objectives for good environmental status. So I now have about 2.5 minutes to talk about the work we're doing on this. So apologies while I kind of run through this rapidly. We've been trying to bring together direct impacts of multiple human activities on the marine environment in a modular way to evaluate some of the trade-offs impacts where possible in relation to good environmental status. This modular format is designed to make it a collaborative way and very open to talking to people about new data layers or new interaction terms that can be brought into this style of analysis. But through this, what we've started doing is looking at hypothetical scenarios at a whole of England scale for offshore wind developments and protected areas acting in combination and looking at what this might mean through, on the top left there, well, the top bit, ecological indicators. This is looking at the risk to sensitive fish species in relation to our GES and OSPAR indicators for sensitive fish and how risk changes as we move these spatial distribution of activities around. Top middle is the indicator of the proportion of physical disturbance to benthic habitats. And obviously this is compared to the baseline. The green shows where things are improving, the red is where they're declining. We've not just limited ourselves to good environmental status indicators. The top right one there is looking at seafloor carbon releases and how that changes. And at the bottom, these are looking at some of the kind of sectoral interactions. You know, what proportion of our fisheries are in areas which may be designated by wind? What's the overlap of MPAs? What's the overlap with the aggregates industry? I mean, this is just hypothetical scenarios here, but shows the capability. It's a nice, simple top-level dashboard, but underneath it, you can start digging into the details of where you might actually see change, which species are affected. And so there, if you do need to proceed with a certain kind of set of choices and you need to put in place some mitigating measures afterwards, you can start identifying where the real points of risk are. And this can kind of get unpacked further. So quite a lot there. Apologies for racing through that, but I guess the point I wanted to make was that there is a real challenge for us as a community. There's a lot of great science. How do we bring this together, and how do we translate our ecological observations, our physical observations in the wild, into the things that matter in the committee papers that get circulated before the meetings where the decisions get made? And we really do need to focus on that translation bit, and we need to condense our information into digestible manner in order to do that. This point is, it is a dedicated task. So there you go. I hope that wasn't too rapid. Very happy to talk about any of this afterwards. Thank you very much, and also very open and keen for collaboration on any of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. I can see many folk having questions for you about how the models work and how the tools work. And I know a lot of the tools that are being considered across ECOWind, like a lot of people will have notes to exchange. So thank you for that. And sort of moving on to our final speaker of this session, and picking up on what Will's just said, some of our evidence barriers. Is it that the evidence isn't credible? Is it legitimate, salient, or digestible? And I think what John Rees from the Crown Estate and CFAS is now going to talk to us about, the Offshore Wind Evidence and Knowledge Hub, is an idea, a space, a program that is working in this space to explore those aspects of evidence so that it can be more readily used for decision making. So if we welcome John to the stage now to hear a bit more about this.
Right, good morning, and thank you for listening and getting here today. So I'm going to talk about OWECA and a little bit about myself just to start with. I'm a physical oceanographer working in CFAS and have worked on the renewable sector since some of the early developments around Scroby and North Oil. So I've had a lot of track record of working in this sector. And I review lots of EIAs as we go through my normal day job. Now, what the big question that has been asked is that it takes nearly 3 years to get an EIA through the approvals process, to get its license conditions. So how, and both the industry, regulators and government all say that we've got to accelerate that process so that we can reach some of these big targets, this 50 gigawatts of wind that we've got to produce by 2030. There's one of Colin's big numbers to start with. So, and at the moment, we're only at 15 gigawatts. So we've got 35 gigawatts to put in the next 6 years. So massive targets. And so how are we going to make sure that we can put these things into the water column, onto the seabed, without doing massive impact on the environment? So that's the big driver that I'm involved in. So I'm going to talk about OWECA, and that's the Offshore Wind Energy Knowledge Hub. So that's another acronym for you to write down. And so what are we trying to do? So we're trying to improve and accelerate the planning of EIAs as they get produced. And so the way I started with it is looked at all the initiatives that are ongoing at the moment in government, in industry, etc. And I just started writing them down. And this is just a small subsection. And I know that there's some missing off this list as I speak. So yeah, do come to me and say, oh, there's another initiative that I've forgotten. So lots of initiatives from different directions, all with the same general target of accelerating the planning process. So we came up with the OWECA approach. So this is our rather long mission statement trying to support and accelerate the process with this two targets of reaching the overall generation target, but without impacting on the marine environment. So we have a group that we've set up, and this is the structure of the group. So around the center of this is the impact assessment group. So they make the overall assessments. And what we've done is created a whole series of these TTGs, so technical topic groups. And those technical topic groups will be very similar to the chapters of an EIA. So a normal EIA is 18 chapters, if I remember rightly. And so we're in the fullness of time, we'll have 18 different technical topic groups. So that'd be a group of both the regulators, the scientists, the consultants, all the different stakeholders that will be interested in that particular chapter of the EIA. So that's the one that we're setting up as we speak. So heritage, shipping and landscape. So those are the ones that we've chosen to prioritize because they are considered, and we'll test this in the next few months, to be relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of the some of the significant impacts on the environment. So those are the three that we're going to take forward now. So the group has got a whole range of different parties in it. Rufus Howard, who is from IEMA and who has done a lot of the background work, is absolutely key to this. He produced something called the Industry Evidence Plan, the IEP, where he's looked at over 70 different EIAs and what were the significant impacts, what were the insignificant impacts, how could you mitigate those particular impacts, and therefore what did the different decision makers, and so that goes to the planning inspectorate in this country in terms of deciding, you know, if that development should go ahead. So the impact assessment is the first level of group, and there's support from industry, from the industry champions here. So that's Greg Tomlinson and Juliet Shrimpton from Renewables UK. And we've got support from Atkins, who are doing some of the work on the actual website and running meetings, etc. So that's the first level. But once these evidence notes, and I'll come on to what an evidence note is in a minute, then that goes up to the different government departments, all the way from DESNES, DEFRA, NRW, Northern Ireland, Welsh Government, Planning Inspectorate, MMO, and we're still trying to get the Scottish Government involved as well. So that's still to be done. So, that's in progress. So they will give the overall approval for these evidence notes. I'll come on to that next. So we've got these first three TTGs underway. So Marine Historic Environment. So these are some of the organizations that we're already talking to in getting these groups up and running. So the first meeting of the group is on the 6th of December. So, you know, it's very, very soon that some of these things are starting to move forward. Shipping and navigation is another one. So Trinity, Coast Guard Agency, etc. And then we're going to move on to Seascape, and that's going to be over the winter. So those will produce these three trial TTGs that we're considering at the moment. So what is actually in an evidence note? So we've heard a lot about, there's lots of products that are coming out already. There's about lots of information on consensus, on standardized monitoring schemes, standardized mitigation schemes. All of that has been agreed, and we need to learn those lessons from the 60 different wind farms that are already being deployed, and make sure that we're gaining all that information and then bringing that back into the approvals process, because at the moment we're not learning those lessons as fast and as efficient as we could do. So these are the sort of some of the things that are going to be in the evidence note. We're going to identify topics of common ground, so consensus building. So, that's a standard phrase that is used all over the place, but, we're trying to bring all that lot together. And also links into, where there's not consensus. So there's the OWIR, the Offshore Wind Evidence Register as well. So, we're hoping that will be able to go forward in the future as well. And there'll be a link directly from these evidence notes to those to that research register. So they will be standardized and verified mitigation options. So this links into OWERs, etc. So there's a whole range of different links to existing programs. So bringing together information from a whole range of different sectors and times. And so these will be living documents with their own DOI, so that as new research comes along from ECOWind, ECOFlow, bringing that latest piece of information into these evidence notes. So what does it look like in terms of a digital landscape? Now, this is a nice plot. I think a lot of my Crown Estate colleagues will recognise this in some form or another. So I quite like these pyramids. So starting off at the bottom, we've got the Marine Data Exchange. So that's where all the data sits. The next level up is the Offshore Wind Evidence and Knowledge Hub. So keyword is Knowledge Hub. So it's a higher level of product that goes into there. And then on top of that, you have the evidence notes that sit, which bring together all of the information. And you can see the various input routes, So you can see the various input routes. So the licensing data that you get from the actual developers, that goes straight into the Marine Data Exchange. But then the higher level products from Scott Mayer, Texas, OWEC, the big £50 million program, ECOWind, they go into the Knowledge Hub. So that's the home of where all of your reports and position papers and evidence notes will go into that evidence hub. So there is a home for the data and products that you're producing already established. So that's the overall Knowledge Hub. But I started off with a list of projects and initiatives, and what we've tried to do is to bring all of those initiatives into one overall slide to see how they all interact. And you won't be surprised to hear that OWECA is in the centre of my plot, and it looks something like this. So there's lots of best practice guidance that's already out there, so that comes straight into it. All the outputs from OWEC, OWIR, Scott Mayer, etc., they will come straight into it. And then there's lots of work being undertaken by the MMO on post-consent monitoring, colleagues in the audience who are heavily involved in that. And then there's work on closing the loop and DEFRA's strategic monitoring program. So that links in. But then on the planning side, there's lots of initiatives there. So whole of seabed, so you've heard lots of information about that. So that links into it as well. But also the best practice in terms of what's going on in terms of regulatory form, and also this group, Pathways to Growth, P2G. So there's lots of initiatives there. So finally, you heard a lot about OWECA. So what the take-home messages is, one, we are looking for volunteers for these TTGs. So if you're interested, please send us an email. There's the two email addresses, my email address and the generic OWECA one. So those that is a general call for all the chapters of an EIA. But also we're hoping to produce these evidence notes in the next couple of months, so that these will be sent out for review, and we're looking for really succinct criticism of them and how we can improve them going forward. And finally, there is an OWECA website, so oweca.com. Go online, register to get some of the news feeds and links into the into the evidence notes as they're produced. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And those are all of our talks for the session. But I hope you've been thinking of some questions, because now we've got a half-hour panel discussion. If I can invite all of our speakers back up to take a seat in the big leather chairs. And how this is going to work in terms of microphones, our online audience. So we've got 3 microphones on stage, well, 2 on stage. And if our speakers can share the lined microphone behind them there, whenever asked a question, and then the brave souls in the audience, if you can come forward and ask a question using the wired microphone at the front here. So that'll be how that will work. And then we've also got our folk online who will also be asking questions. So while we're thinking, unless there's a first question, I've already got one loaded. No? Okay, great. Oh, yes, okay.
Thank you, guys. That was really, really good. Enjoyed all of that. I've got a question across the panel. Basically, a lot of the stuff I've seen what you guys produced and your approaches, a lot of layers of information. And also listening to a lot of this, priorities have been talked about. So I'd really like to ask everyone on the panel who wants to answer it about what are the priorities? How do you prioritize? And 2, with all these layers, how do you deal with the interaction between the layers?
Thank you, Beth. Will, would you like to go first? There's the, so you've got to pass it across.
The priorities one, I guess, following on the theme of are we achieving good environmental status, I would look to see where we are potentially failing as one of the starting point. There are routine assessments, these are available. And if you want to dig deeper, there is also quite often information as to what are the drivers causing this. Although I guess there is one line of argument saying if we're already failing, maybe that's a lost cause and we should maybe focus on the bits where we're not failing and checking we don't fail. So I've already undermined my own priority. On interactions, I mean, you are bringing in interactions between the layers that I showed there. There are, I guess, the distinction I would have maybe is between what you might call operational information tools, which you keep live and use regularly, and then sort of more one-off research studies where people do the more sophisticated analysis. And you've seen, you know, just thinking about ecosystem interactions, there's some very good statistical analysis which identify the strong linkages. And that's where I think some of the kind of more one-off R&D type studies then feed into these longer term live operational evidence tools, because they inform which are the key interactions you worry about. I mean, short of kind of going through layer by layer and which interaction is used in each case, that's how I would kind of prioritize the interactions. And that's what we have started doing where we can in the approaches we're developing.
Any other thoughts across the panel on prioritization?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think from the statutory advisor perspective, the priorities very much relate to the consent risks. So where we can see that issues will cause consent risk, that's where we're likely to try and want to reduce uncertainty. Hopefully that was reflected in some of what I was saying. And I think it was John might have mentioned that earlier, that's the Offshore Wind Environment Evidence Register. So that is a kind of cross-sector look at where we think the data gaps are. And JNCC did a really good bit of work a couple of years ago for ornithology, possibly for the other receptors as well. And we're trying to prioritise within that long list of gaps, which ones we think are really critical from that kind of consent risk angle. So I think there are a couple of bits of work that you know could guide us to some of that prioritization.
Hi, yeah, I'd agree that I think going back to my Venn diagram of at the beginning with the politics and the evidence and the delivery, is that ultimately at some point a compromise has to be made around policy options that are being considered. So to us about the interactions, it's us having the best confidence we can that is the best option at that time based on the brilliant advice that we get in from our statutory nature conservation bodies, and but also that bigger picture, as I say, that there is the other factors that play the part, such as the big politics circle as well. So it's around just, we'll never have enough information, but it's just, are we comfortable at this point to make this decision, to make this leap right now? So I would say that's something that policy are trying to grapple with. I would say from my side, on the science side of DEFRA and having that sort of cross-cutting view across these multiple policy areas, I would say the big priorities for us are around being able to recognise and monitor or understand a change, whether it's a compensatory change or whether it's a gain or whether it's just, holding the line. So understanding the shifting baseline, understanding the food web is a big one for us. I would say that's cross-cutting across all of our policy areas. So that's how the energy moves throughout the system. So I would, and seafloor integrity as well. That's another priority for us, because it's just, that's something on the DEFRA side at our level that we're still we need to get our head around that a lot more to be able to take that into consideration in our decisions.
Yeah, so I'd say, we have a range of different drivers for prioritization across that ecosystem, as similar to what Victoria was saying, in terms of, well, if we think about it from the sort of whole of seabed program perspective, we can think about it both, well, what should we prioritize in terms of what could we make better about our analysis, what sectors could we improve the most, and in that sense, and one of the things that we're looking at quite a lot at the moment is how do we keep pushing forward on how we reflect nature in the whole of seabed. That's one of our really pressing priorities at the moment through this iteration. Equally, we get priorities from the policy landscape upstream in that relationship between evidence and policy, which will inflect what we do in a slightly different way and make those value judgments of, well, can we push across all of those evidence priorities all at once, or do we need to pause on some while we deliver against this shorter term priority that's come from a different area of our business or that wider landscape? So I think it's not one source, one set of people who always make the prioritization decisions immediately within a program, I would say. I think we always have to think about those different sources of where we're getting our information, where those different drivers lie, in order to really get a grip of, I guess, how dynamically we need to prioritize in a really fast moving space, both in evidence and in terms of policy as well.
From my point of view, because I'm looking at 18 different chapters within an EIA, there are certain chapters that are always, quite high profile, and so they will tend to dominate what we're working on. But I think the one that really does stand out to me is the cumulative impacts, because we're going to industrialize the marine environment over the next few decades for a whole range of reasons, and so looking at that both within that particular sector and the cross-sectoral impacts from, say, a wind farm to aggregate extraction or fisheries, I think that is going to be the high-profile work that we need to do in the future.
Thank you all. Lots of interesting answers to your question, Beth. And I think there's quite a lot to chew on there. We've got an online question. I'd like to take something from the online audience, please, Paul.
Spain is the independent chair of the National Grid Stakeholders Advisory Group. Chris asks, is Poseidon considering an opportunities map alongside its risk map to inform proactive nature recovery?
I think that's a question for Alex, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris. So it isn't explicitly looking for opportunity, although obviously the inverse of the risk might be seen as opportunity. But we hope that it can be used in that kind of nature recovery discussion that Chris mentioned, because it will give us that understanding, I guess, particularly for benthic communities. There are all sorts of traits and metrics of rarity and biodiversity and things like that through the one benthic system that CFAS are using within Poseidon. So it definitely lends itself to conversations about nature recovery, but it isn't a specific aim of the project to highlight where they are. It's for the user to kind of interrogate it in that way.
Thanks, Alex. Another question, please. Over there. It's a long way, but if you can let us know who you are and where you work, please.
So, Tim Smythe, Plymouth Marine Laboratory. My question is to Will. So I liked the addition of digestibility in your pie diagram or your pie. So what does great digestibility look like from a science perspective? And the other question is, you sometimes get indigestion from inconvenient evidence. So can you unpack any of that for us, please?
I guess the digestibility bit was meant on the way in which it's presented rather than the content. So it's not about not giving inconvenient messages. It's about making sure your message is understandable. I think what does good digestibility look like? I think that different audiences will be able to absorb different levels of information. It's at times you might kind of get a request saying, what is, just, you know, hypothetically, what are the issues around wind farms in one paragraph? And that is what you have to work with. So, you know, a long exposition around, you know, sometimes this goes up over here and it goes down over there, and then under these circumstances, maybe it's a bit different. That is indigestible, I would suggest. It's not a case of saying this is good or bad being digestible. I think this is where you need to kind of speak to the evidence users and sit down and understand what they really want and what they can take on board. And I guess it's recognizing, as we're each focusing on our own particular areas, which we get really absorbed in, at the point of a decision, there may be 20 or 30 other pieces of evidence all coming to the table, where there are 20 or 30 people behind those, all as involved in their own topic, and they all need to land their messages at the same time.
When that evidence was particularly digestible for a particular audience. If you, I mean, I don't want you to come up with that necessarily, but it would be really useful for us as a community to know what great, you know, where there has been an example where that has been particularly good. And actually the flip side of that, of where it's been actually not good at all.
If you don't mind, Tim, if I can open this up actually as well, because this is a really, really interesting question. It's one I actually think quite a lot about myself, and we can maybe reframe it. How do we make our evidence more appetizing before it becomes digestible? and ask other members of the panel as well if they've got some views on this, because it's very, very important. It's very important.
Yeah, if I may also one quick thing, then pass the microphone along. I think one part is framing our work in the language of the audience. Don't use our terms, work out how they talk about an issue, use their words. And then I think what we've started doing in a number of, in CFAS, been doing a lot of work internationally. We've been doing kind of state of the marine environment reports for whole countries across the whole state of the environment. How do you distill that down? And it's about structuring the evidence. So we'll have kind of, everyone loves the traffic lights, very easy. You can look at a page, 10 things, clear sort of high level thing, a confidence measure next to it, and then signposts to the next level of detail down. So I guess it's as much about how you structure the whole package of evidence rather than just what's that top sheet look like, so people can drill down where they need to.
Hi, I just think I just wanted to say, I think what a good example of something that's really digestible was yesterday. It was the postgraduate presentations, the PhD presentations, like when they were getting like, this is my key point at the end, just that boom, that message, that really, really landed with me. And I'm not saying that all of everything else didn't, but I just think there's just something about just getting your point across in that way. So, and I know that there's lots of coaching and training that the students get about how they present that information. But to me, just as somebody who works in DEFRA, those messages got across to me very clearly yesterday. So I'd say that's a good example of digestible information that I heard.
Yeah, and just to add a perspective, so we have within my team, we have a Teams thread, and people are always posting links to new papers on that thread, but there's so little time to read it, to understand it. So I would say, come and give us a webinar, approach us, say you want to talk about the work that you've done, give us 45 minutes so we can ask questions of what you've done and have that deep understanding without needing to find, 3 hours in our busy days to really read something and understand it. So yeah, I think it is about just that communication and, like we were saying yesterday, knowing the right people to have the conversations with, getting them together and allowing that space for discussion.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to come in on that?
I can briefly. I guess what I'd always think about when we do, from the sort of whole of CBER perspective, where we've got a really broad evidence base. If you have a wide range of scenarios that each cover 10 sectors, which each have a different spatial footprint, and each of them has however many hundreds of thousands of kilometers squared of data that sit beneath it, I would always come back to, well, what question has been asked of our evidence program? What decision is trying to be made? Therefore, what? And then our job as owners of that evidence base is to down select exactly what we should be extracting from it. Because if we open that up entirely, we've got a load of numbers, we've got a load of stats. We can give you lots of kilometers squared of various metrics. I think it's just always about coming back to what question has been asked of it. And sometimes that means going a bit of back and forth with whoever's asking the question to make sure that they understand that and making sure that essentially that you've got to the right point at which you've got a useful question that is being asked and which you then can contextualize your evidence base around. And that's how you're going to be able to drill down and get something really succinct in terms of presenting.
Thank you. We have another online question. Over to you, Paul.
What should be the priority for a strategic monitoring program? Should it be filling evidence gaps, de-risk the EIA, reducing the EIA monitoring costs, understanding the status assessment, better strategic decision making, all of these support something else?
That's a big question. Anyone got a starter for 10?
Yes, probably.
Okay, it's a good start.
That's what we're trying to figure out.
Okay.
Hang on, it's John.
Tick all of the above, I think.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure it out. Unless anybody else.
There were a lot of ingredients raised in that question, a lot of different things that we've spoken about over yesterday, today. I think it touches a bit on priorities and how you would prioritize all those different factors, which ones would rise to the top, which ones are more important. As such, yes, it's a very difficult question. So, I mean, probably is a good way to start, I think. And I can say that members of a panel all seem to be working in different areas where they are looking at this in some shape or form. Anything to add?
One way I think about this is that if you think about it in terms of, you've got an illness, you go to the GP. There are thousands of diagnostic tests hospitals can run on you. There's x-rays, there's blood tests, there's scans, there's heart rates, everything. But if you walk into the GPs and you go, I'm not feeling very well, they don't suddenly book you in for every single possible test and evaluation that could be done. It'd be hugely time consuming and far more expensive than anyone can do. So the way I kind of think about it is quite often, if you think about it in terms of your health, there are a few key performance indicators, as it were, that are the kind of headline things that you would track. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can immediately diagnose what the issue is or what the solution is once you're failing on one of those key performance indicators. So when thinking about monitoring, I think it's useful to think about what are the key performance indicators that we're trying to achieve, and then what are the kind of diagnostic monitoring sort of things that you would then want to identify a suitable intervention in the case that you are then failing on one of your KPIs. And so, for example, we really care about sensitive fish species. So the key performance indicator is their abundance. But if you see that dropping, that doesn't tell you if it's climate change or if it's wind farms or it's fishing. And so I think it's just useful when kind of trying to work out how you bring these various bits of information strands together is what are the key performance indicators? We really want to keep an eye on those. And then as and when the kind of warning lights start flashing, what is it that you would then look at? Now, the tricky bit is about often with those bits that you then want to look at, you kind of go, well, we really need 10 years worth of time series data to really understand. So there are some where you need to be kind of pre-identifying some key things to track along, but you can't look at everything. So I think it's what's the things you most care about? Let's track those. And then the symptom, the cure, you have to then pick up sometimes case by case because there isn't money to do everything all the time.
Yeah. Thank you, Will. Question from the front here, Francis. Not got much time for questions, so this might be one of our last ones.
Francis Daunt from UKCH PI of ECOWings. It was a question about how you work with Scotland. Our magic number is a UK number, the Collins number. I know we're hearing from Scotland after the break, but I get a sense that it's still quite hard. You often present yourselves as an English-focused panel. Again today, but how do we bring it all together? Thanks.
Just as we go into that, I was glad to see a mention of Scott Mayer in the OECA diagram, so that is coming in. Do you want to start us off, John?
Certainly, Scott Mayer is a big program that we've identified where there's a whole load of monitoring going on. There's research going on around that. So we directly see that as an input into OECA. The challenge for us is, getting into the various organisations at that high level. Whereas we've got the, people like Scottish Heritage and people like that, we've got access into them at the Marine Directorate level and that sort of level. It's quite hard because this resource constrained at the moment. So that's why in my diagram I've got the Scottish link grayed out to some extent. So they are a contributing member, electronically, but they don't contribute into the review process. But we've got Northern Ireland and Welsh Government in there, so we have got that open door approach.
So in terms of whole of seabeds, we're in active dialogue with Crown Estate Scotland about how we basically about the methods that we've applied across England, Welsh and Northern Irish waters, and basically what have we learned from that? What can benefit the both of us in having that broader understanding and how that interrelates with Scottish waters. I guess that concept doesn't just apply to thinking about Scottish waters. If we think about some of the things we look at in whole of seabed, whether that's cabling or different aspects of nature, why stop at the UKEZ? You could ask the same question there. A lot of the time it will come back to priorities and how much resource we can put into different areas and how we essentially structure that work over a longer period of time. And again, just how do we drill down and make sure that we're spending our analytical time in the most effective way possible for the questions that are being asked of us.
About a minute left just to explore Scottish links. Yes, over to Alex.
I think I just wanted to say, yeah, I forgot to mention, so myself and my team, we just covered English waters, and obviously it is devolved about how we manage and monitor for marine biodiversity, and also for the DEFRA's side on the offshore wind. We are linked up, I would say, on business as usual monitoring. I think there is still some work to do on potentially like how we can go forward strategically in the future. So, for example, like if we've got surveys going out, you know, we check with our counterparts in Scotland, you know, can we maximise a survey and things like that. So I would say this is a business as usual activity, but yeah, looking towards the strategic side, I think there is something to explore there.
Yeah, and I just asked, I think my perspective is a bit different from yours, Francis, because certainly the two OEC projects we're leading, although we're leading them as Natural England, they both are operating at UK scale. We've got Marine Government on the Project Advisory Group, and we've got Nature Scott in the Technical Advisory Group. So we are very much not doing them in isolation. We are trying to make it inclusive. And the stuff that we're trying to do in terms of reforms, ornithology impact assessment, we're talking actively with JNCC and Nature Scott and NRW, let's not forget them. So yeah, we are very much not trying to bury our head in the sand about what our counterparts are up to. And the final point I'd make, obviously each of the statutory advisors is responsible for producing their own best practice guidance, but if we can move towards more of that collaborative synthesis of evidence approach, then we might see more convergence in the advice that's provided across the various agencies.
If that's all, that's us at the end of the session now. I don't want to eat into your break anymore. I'm sure you all want a cup of coffee. So if we can give a big round of applause for all of our speakers, please. And thank you for all the questions as well. So all refreshments are through the door there. If you can be back in here for 11:30, please. 11:30. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming back from your cup of tea or coffee, but maybe that's because it's freezing through there and slightly warmer through here. So maybe you're encouraged to come through. Just a wee sort of note of process. Please do not be afraid to come and queue up at the microphone to ask questions, because I'm being blinded by the lights, and so I might not see people sticking their hands up in the air. So with all your critical questions, please do come to the microphone and just form a wee queue. That would be excellent. So thank you for that. The other thing is that we were due to have 4 speakers for this session, but we've only got 3. So that does mean either we finish 8 minutes early, or the speakers have the honor of running over by 2 minutes each, and I won't be too draconian on that. So there we go. So that's the processes that we are going to go through. Anyway, this is the last session for the conference, and it's on strategic compensation and marine net gain. Now, I was sitting the other day reading this paper, and I was going dee-dee-da-dee-da, reading through it, and then I came across MNG. And I thought, what on earth's MNG? And then I suddenly thought, oh, it's made it to the acronyms. It must be famous already. Marine net gain, oh dear. So what we have is another acronym to join with all the others that we've got in this sphere of marine science and policy. So hopefully our speakers are going to elucidate for us that instead of it just being MNG, it is something marine net gain. And it's quite important actually that we understand this, because as was highlighted in the last session there, we've got to communicate to the decision makers, to policy, to the public, what it is that we're trying to achieve. And if we say, well,
MNG is so critical because of the MPAs, and then there's the MCZs, because in England waters we don't have MPAs, they're in Scottish waters, and in Scottish waters we don't have MCZs, and of course we have the SRRPs and the SCCPs and whatever else it is. It's just totally incomprehensible. So that's just a wee wordie to the speakers not to use MNG. Okay. The other thing is that I Googled strategic compensation just to see what Google came up with. And actually, it's a human resource management technique. Now, the importance of that point is that, again, when we're speaking to the people out there, and when you're speaking to the next person that you're advising, and you start speaking about strategic compensation, where is their head going to go? Unlikely it's going to go to some alternative management process in the marine environment. It's more likely going to go to human resources and payment of staff, or in some way compensating staff to deliver the objectives of a company. So again, a wee wordie to the speakers. Think about what actually strategic compensation is in this context. But for everybody, how should we explain it to people in terms of the fact that so their mind doesn't simply shoot off somewhere else in the big sort of world of words that mean different things to different people? Because tomorrow, today will be yesterday. And what that means is we have moved on. But actually, if tomorrow I'm still thinking about, well, what actually is strategic compensation? What does it mean? Then actually, tomorrow, today will be yesterday, will have been a waste of time. Okay? So, just a wee wordie to help people think about what we're going to hear about. And I'm really keen to hear about all this, because actually marine net gain is something about which I just can't get my head around, to be perfectly honest, folks. I find considerable difficulty when you're going to be adding up apples plus pears plus grapes plus potatoes plus turnips plus carrots, and then the end sum has to be converted into soup. How do we do that? Well, hopefully, Audrey Jones from Hull Marine Consulting is going to tell us, as she gives us an update on marine net gain. Audrey, thank you very much.
So thank you for that, Colin. Should have had that warning before I came up here. That would have been useful. So as Colin said, I am Audrey Jones. I work for Howell Marine Consulting, and I'm here with two hats on, I guess. I am part of the ECOFlow champion team. I am the impact lead for Howell Marine on ECOFlow, but I'm also working on MNG evidence-based sort of development for projects that we're working for Natural England and DEFRA. So my talk is predominantly about MNG, which is marine net gain. But I also feel I probably need to elucidate on what strategic compensation is, because I'm not sure that's coming up in any of the talks. I guess in this space, and you do forget, because you sort of live and breathe it, that you forget that people don't maybe know the different technical reasons behind it, but compensation in this space is very much linked to habitats regulations and the Marine and Coastal Access Act, and talked very much about compensating for the impacts to those features within marine protected areas. Whereas marine net gain is much wider. It's talking about sort of delivering gain across all of the English seas. And I guess sort of picking up on a point that Francis raised earlier, this is about marine net gain is an English policy, a solely English policy, doesn't even stretch into Wales. So this focus of my talk is very much about England. We know that Scotland is looking at nature positive initiatives, but they're not here today to talk about that. And I think Wales is still watching to see what we're up to around sort of marine enhancement. So, Colin, I will tell you what marine net gain is, in theory. So it's an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. So its intention is to try and reverse the loss of marine biodiversity, either through habitat creation and restoration schemes or through pressure reduction, so removing pressures that are already being exerted onto the marine environment. It's very much sort of playing into the sort of marine licensing and consenting process. So it's embedding environmental improvement into the heart of infrastructure planning and development. As I said before, its intention is to try and leave the environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. And picking up Colin's challenge there, it is quite a tall order to be able to do that. So when we're thinking about marine net gain and the project I want to talk to you about, it's very much sort of thinking about, I guess, the constraints that we're working in when we're thinking about this. So it is a nature-first regulatory framework, and we need to come up with something that's proportionate, accountable, consistent and repeatable. It's transparent and it's targeted. It needs to be legally robust, and it needs to have limited additional economic burden. Picking up what Victoria was saying there, very much thinking about the politics and how you will get this out to be actual legislation, you need to demonstrate that you're not actually bringing a new burden onto development, given offshore wind and the targets we're trying to meet. So this slide just gives you an overview of all the different work that DEFRA is trying to undertake in order to bring marine net gain into sort of mandatory framework. And how marine is involved in the three sort of strands that are coloured peach in that diagram. And today I really want to talk to you about the marine net gain assessment tool. But we also working in the ecological evidence. So trying to identify what the ecological opportunities are and the priorities for those opportunities. And we're also working on projects sort of looking at how you might want to pilot this. It's all very well doing this in this theoretical sort of space, but how do you actually deliver it on the ground? What pathways do you need to do that? Do you have current legislation behind it, which allows it to be used for marine net gain? So the marine net gain assessment tool project we're working on is we're trying to define an approach to linking development to marine net gain. And picking up what Colin was saying there, it's trying to sort of work out how you get that common currency between apples, grapes and pears and turning it into soup. I like that. So the Marine Net Gain Assessment Framework Project, I know some of you in this room have been involved. We've been set out a task to assess potential frameworks, to assess ecological losses and gains to inform marine net gain. And that ecological bit is the underpinning driver behind it. We're looking at habitats and mobile species. The terrestrial equivalent has just focused on habitats. In the marine environment, we're trying to bring that into that mobile species, so marine birds, mammals, and fish. We're only looking at the subtidal element. We will look at how it interfaces in the intertidal area, but biodiversity net gain is already down to that marine low water mark. And the project is developing the evidence base to support the development of an MNG mechanism. And we're hoping that the outcomes will be an understanding across the sectors on the approach to measuring ecological loss and gain in the marine environment in a regulatory framework. And we'll try and provide recommendations on the development of an MNG framework for England. So as part of this process, we set up a technical advisory group made up of scientists who can provide us advice on what is and isn't possible to deliver marine net gain. A number of you in this room were part of that. So we set up a 2-day workshop at the beginning of July, which was very fruitful and gave us lots of information. And we have taken that information and turned it into some assumptions about how you can take marine net gain forward. The first assumption is that MNG will require a strategic spatial plan for nature restoration, which sets targets based on opportunity and priority. And that priority point comes up again to make sure you don't get perverse outcomes. And we're not just looking for the low-hanging fruit, we're looking at trying to prioritize where you want to actually deliver restoration. And the strategic nature restoration plan should be linked to the UKMS GES indicators, as this is the underlying environmental outcome for UK seas. And such a plan should allow for regional assessment alongside local delivery and should be explicitly linked to the UKMS programme of measures. The next assumptions around ecosystem modeling. The first one being that it became apparent that in the academic sphere, ecosystem modeling is much further ahead and used much more widely than it is used in the regulatory sphere. So the recommendation being that ecosystem modeling techniques should be more readily used in UK environmental impact assessment processes. And the next assumption is around sort of ecosystem functionality and saying that actually whilst assessments of ecosystem functionality and dynamics are possible on a case-by-case basis, they have too much dynamic complexity within them to make connections between the contribution towards ecosystem functionality of different ecosystem components, features, or indeed the same components in different biogeographic spaces. That's precise enough to currently support a generic regulatory metric-based approach for all descriptors. So that's basically saying that you can't impact maybe on seagrass and then deliver gain for oysters and say that you've got exactly the same ecosystem functionality. We just don't have that understanding and knowledge in the marine environment at the moment. The last assumption is around natural capital approach. So we were tasked at looking at whether you could bring in different layers, moving from features to ecosystem functionality up to sort of applying this at a natural capital level. But the advice we've got is that the approach of developing a framework for marine net gain in the short term requires the ability to make decisions within consenting that are focused primarily on ecological loss and gain. This must allow for consistent, proportionate judgments on how the loss from a project relates to ecological targets, using techniques and evidence that are currently available. And we're saying that the natural capital evidence base just is not currently developed enough to make that from a loss perspective, but we're saying that it could be used as a tool to help sort of understand how you can make trade-offs about where you want to put your gain measures if you want to bring in the human aspect and ecosystem services into that decision. So we've taken those assumptions and developed a sort of suggestion for a marine net gain delivery model. And I have to stress here, this is a draft and it's very much sort of HMCs and ERM and other consultants to be working with thinking. It does not represent government policy. So I'll just go over that. So I'm very well, I've got 45 seconds. So this is the model that we have produced. If we can read that there. So at the heart is good environmental status. And we're saying that we need to develop a strategic nature restoration plan that's based on the UKMS programme of measures and looking at that sufficiency assessment to determine what is needed still in the strategic nature restoration plan to deliver good environmental status. And then from that, you could determine what proportion marine net gain can deliver to that strategic nature restoration plan. And then underneath that, we're saying that should then be developed into a regional programme of measures, which again, can then say how much marine net gain can deliver to that regional programme of measures, which then flows down into local delivery of MNG measures, which can be delivered through a number of routes. And they're coming back to that common currency and linking it back to development and the requirement not to add an extra economic burden. We're saying that you would use the current environmental assessment techniques that are undertaken for developments, and you would leave the assessment sort of conservation features as it is at the moment to the HABS regs and marine coastal zone assessments. But then you would use the data from environmental impact assessments and turn that into a GES effect assessment. So you would take your impacts at EIA level and translate that into impacts on GES descriptors. And from that, you could understand your allocation of MNG requirement per descriptor. And then that would feed back into the delivery on the ground, which is all then linked up with all the lovely monitoring that's happening. And I guess hence some of the questions from Dickon yesterday is that can we translate the monitoring that's happening and the evidence gathering that's happening into its potential impact on GES descriptors, if that is the underpinning goal we're trying to achieve. And sorry, I've massively overrun. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Audrey. And I noticed there another acronym, MNGAF. That's that's another interesting one to have. Okay. Again, just to remind you, if you want to ask a question, you can come up, you can queue, or actually you could sit in the seats in between time so you don't feel you're standing in front of everybody half the time. We will do them all at the end. Yeah. Keep it simple. So next, by the way, I'm not Dickon. Just in case you were wondering, as you know, he's not here, so I've jumped in at the last minute. So can I now welcome to the stage Anna Tarbert from Renewable UK, are going to be speaking about OWIC pilots. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much. Yes, I'm Anna Tarbert. I represent the Offshore Wind Industry Council at Renewable UK. It's a bit of a misnomer actually on the list because I'm actually going to talk to you about strategic compensation. So no pressure based on what's been said so far. Let's just move down. So what is strategic compensation? I feel like that's what everyone wants to know. Just generally about compensation, I think probably everyone in the room knows this, but I've tried to just cover it really quickly. But in short, where projects, plans or activities cannot be ruled out as having an adverse effect on site integrity, then they will be required to do compensation via a derogation process. Now, there's various criteria that projects need to meet to be allowed to do that. And one of them is that they need to be able to show that they can, the Secretary of State or whoever's making the decision needs to be satisfied that the environmental compensation can be provided. Now, there's been various offshore wind projects consented under that process to date. So we've got Hornsea 3 and 4, Norfolk Boreas and Vanguard, East Anglia 1, and the Sheringham Shoal and Dudgeon extensions. And there's also a large number of projects, both in England and Scotland, that are currently relying on that process, that are going through examination at the moment. Now, to date, compensation has been delivered on a project-by-project basis. So we've had onshore, nearshore artificial nesting structures, predator reduction, and removal of marine litter. It's been quite piecemeal, and I think what's been really clear is that as the pipeline grows, that's not going to be sufficient, and we've not necessarily delivered the best ecological outcomes overall. So what we need to do is take this more coordinated approach, so developers, government, stakeholders, to try and both identify and deliver those required environmental compensation measures. That should have a dual benefit of both de-risking and speeding up the consent process, but also pooling monies together should enable us to undertake more challenging measures that would be disproportionate on a project-by-project basis, but could lead to bigger environmental improvement. Now, one of the things that was recommended under the Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Package was to produce a library of strategic compensation measures. There's 3 that have been approved so far. One around benthic, which is MPA extensions, which is government-led compensation measure, and on which a government ministerial statement, I believe, is due imminently, we hope, and 2 around birds. Although one of those is time limited, I think that's quite important to note. And I think what also is clear from that is that that's not going to be enough measures to compensate for the whole pipeline of offshore wind that we know we need to deliver. And potentially it might not even be enough for those offshore wind farms that are currently operational and maybe relying on compensation just for routine maintenance activities. The other thing I just wanted to cover on this slide, I'm covering a lot in this slide, is non-like-for-like requirement. So currently, compensation measures are targeted at providing compensation or benefit to the specific feature that was impacted. So like-for-like compensation. But one of the recommendations that came out of the Offshore Wind Champion report was that in order to support accelerated deployment, where like-for-like was not possible, government should enable developers to provide broader measures that improve wider marine ecosystems, and that includes undertaking work identified by government to improve the condition of sites. And again, the thinking around this is both to increase the number of measures available, but also accelerate marine recovery at some sites. So moving on, the project I'm actually working on for the Offshore Wind Industry Council, we've completely missed the trick when it came to NATI acronym. So we've just called ourselves the Strategic Compensation Studies. We've gone for a RON-SEAL approach with naming the project. What is it? It's a £3.5 million project running until the end of 2027.
We have been funded as part of the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme, so led by the Crown Estate, but also in partnership with DEFRA and DESNES. We have significant contributions as well, and in-kind contributions from participating OIC members, so that's our developers. The project aims and objectives are up there. I don't intend reading them to you, though if you're sitting at the back, you might not be able to see them. But what are we basically trying to do? So we are looking to provide more confidence in the measures available. We want to do lots of practical trials, collating evidence to help fill data gaps and try and answer some of those we just don't know questions. We're really keen to ensure projects can be consented and conditions discharged in a timely way. We want relevant frameworks and mechanisms in place so that those measures can be delivered. And we also want to consent more measures that will enable offshore wind to support marine recovery, align with the overarching goals for a marine space within the UK, and ensure the ecological cohesion of the site network. So work packages, we have 6 work packages. Again, they're on the screen behind me. Hopefully you can read them. I don't intend on going through them in great detail. We've got one around artificial nesting structures, one on predator reduction. So those are some of the approved measures in the library at the moment. Then we've got packages around habitat creation and restoration, infrastructure removal, delivery mechanism and overarching actions. So lots of lessons learned in there, some of our forecasting work, and our supporting measures, which is our catch-all, basically, for anything that didn't fit into any of the above, and gives us a little bit of flexibility to be, so if anything comes online that we think is really interesting, we've got some budget, hopefully, to look at that. Hopefully what this slide emphasises, it's quite a broad range of topics we are looking to look at within the project itself. And I think what we're really aware of is there's lots of knowledge and evidence gaps. Lots of people in this room are working towards filling some of those. We're really keen that we don't duplicate effort and that we're using the money in the most efficient way. So yeah, but lots and lots of work. Some of these scopes of work are also currently being developed, especially around some of those wider benefits. So some of the non-like for like. So again, we're really keen to talk to people about some of those bits of work. Areas of interest. So again, we just thought it might be interesting for some people in the room there are some specific areas we're looking at in terms of monitoring or doing some additional evidence gathering. So we are looking to do some enhanced monitoring around kittiwake. Personally, I'm really interested in diet and eDNA, but that's just a personal thing. But how can we use that to understand what birds are eating in different areas of the UK? For the habitat creation restoration work, how do we start to quantify some of those wider ecosystem benefits? So some of the things I know you guys are looking at, we specifically be really interested in projects that are delivering habitat creation or restoration in the next couple of years, where we might be able to bolt on some additional monitoring just to look at a wider range of impacts. We're also quite keen to look at what's already been done in terms of interconnectivity. So I know there's been lots of work done sort of looking at the distribution of seabirds across the UK, but do we understand how they're actually moving between those sites? Again, is there something we can help facilitate and help fund that would allow us to understand that a lot better? And bycatch mitigation is something we're quite interested in as well. We've currently been doing some pilot trials to try and understand quantify what the actual bycatch issue is there an issue and how much is it impacting our birds? But yeah, we'd be potentially really interested in, again, doing some practical trials of some of the mitigation measures to try and see if it could be a strategic compensation measure. That was a massive, really quick run through of everything we're doing. I just want to say thank you for inviting us along to talk to you. Myself and Emily, sitting at the back in the white jumper, we're here until the end of lunch. If you are interested or you think you've got anything relevant, we're really keen to share data, to collaborate with different projects. As I said, there's so much work happening in this space. I think it's just really key that we are working together and we're using the money we've got in the project to provide the best, I hate the word bang for buck, but yeah, doing that basically. So yeah, thank you very much. And I've still got 37 seconds. Woo.
Thank you very much, Anna. And that's helping. I'm beginning to develop understandings here. So our last speaker of the conference today is Eleni. Oh, there we go, from Ørsted. And Elaine is going to be speaking about compensation and marine net gain, a need for a more strategic approach. Thank you very much.
Hey everyone, thanks very much for having me. So yeah, I'm Eleni Antonio. I'm a Strategic Environment and Policy Manager at Orsted, and today I'm going to be covering 4 main areas. I'm going to give an overview of the current regulatory landscape. I'm going to cover some of the challenges that we're seeing in enabling a strategic approach. I'll present Orsted's biodiversity framework, and I will cover the future needs that we have as we develop a strategic approach. Firstly, just a quick overview of Orsted. We are a global leader in renewable energy and offshore wind. Here you can see our presence across the UK. So we have projects here in development, construction and operation, covering offshore wind, onshore wind, solar and storage projects. And we generate 7% of the UK's electricity. So to start with a quick overview of the current regulatory landscape, we have a range of regulations to protect and enhance the marine environment in the UK. And that you can see here, I've got a few in the bubbles, but at the moment, what's not clear is how they all interlink and what are the synergies between them. And that's why we really need to work towards having a more strategic approach. So just to touch on a few of them, we've obviously got the habitats regulations that can lead to requirements for ecological compensation, which we're increasingly seeing as a need for many offshore wind projects. We've also got the biodiversity net gain, which is already in place onshore and is coming in for NSIPs. Next year, we've got marine net gain, which Audrey has already touched upon. And we also have a number of voluntary commitments that companies are setting for net positive biodiversity impact. So at Orsted, we have the ambition that all new renewable energy projects we commission from 2030 onwards should deliver a net positive biodiversity impact. And it's really positive that we have all of these standards. However, we need to ensure that they don't become a barrier to the implementation of renewable energy projects. And we have seen really significant delays in recent years to consenting of offshore wind projects because of compensation requirements. We know the government has really ambitious targets. They've got their clean power mission for 2030. And it's really essential that we find solutions to deliver for both biodiversity and climate, because the two crises are really interlinked. Just to give a quick overview of a couple of Orsted's projects. So on the top here, we have our Wilder Humber partnership, when we're in partnership with Yorkshire and Lincolnshire Wildlife Trusts. We're working to restore seagrass, salt marsh, sand dunes, and reintroduce native oysters. And then at the bottom here, we have a project close to my heart, the 103 artificial nesting structures for kittiwake, which were a compensation requirement. And we were really proud that last summer, the summer just gone, we had our first kittiwake chick on our nearshore structure in off the coast of East Suffolk. So we all know that a strategic approach is needed, and we've heard across the last couple of days some really positive progress is being made, and there's consensus across the industry that that's the direction we need to head in. But there's definitely still some challenges to enabling that. For example, consent conditions, they require usually a time frame for when measures need to be in place before certain activities can commence. So whether that's construction or operation of the wind farm itself. And because strategic measures aren't available yet, it means that projects usually are developing their project by project measures in parallel to mitigate risk to project timeframes. We see layer upon layer of precaution being added to impact assessments because of uncertainty in model estimates. And the risk there is that it could result in compensation projects that are a larger scale than what's required. And that could reduce the headroom of compensation available to future projects, which is a risk because there's so few measures available at the moment. Touching on some of the other challenges and really raising questions as well. We have different assessment frameworks across all of the different regulations, and how can we join those up to have a more strategic approach? In addition, is there a way that we can look at delivering outcomes to meet multiple regulatory requirements rather than for each specific one individually? Do we need to be able to trace monetary spend to a particular outcome? And also, can we work towards looking at more of a focus on ecosystem functionality and resilience rather than the like-for-like individual project-by-project approach that we're seeing at the moment? So at Orsted, we identified the need to have one consolidated framework that we can use to measure our corporate commitment and to apply globally and for both onshore and offshore projects. So we have an 8-step process here, which is our biodiversity framework, and it focuses on identifying priority biodiversity features, accounting for potential impacts, setting up a biodiversity action plan, and ensuring transparent monitoring and reporting. Now, there are many metrics to measure biodiversity impact, and this is just one example that demonstrates how we can potentially move towards a more strategic approach going forwards. So to finish, I just want to touch on some of our future needs as we all work towards these strategic solutions. So I think one of the needs is the Marine Recovery Fund, which I'm actually surprised I don't think I've heard mentioned yet over the next couple of days. But it's great that Marine Recovery Funds are in development, but they need to be expedited, definitely. We need to ensure that the payments into the fund can immediately discharge conditions for developers so that they don't cause delays to projects. And we need to have flexibility so that payments into the fund could contribute towards, for example, both compensation and net gain, and not only fund packages of measures, but also monitoring and research so that we can better understand the priorities for the marine environment. We also need alignment between funds, where there are going to be multiple ones, so that we can all work together and have a really collaborative approach. It's really important that we do move more towards ecosystem functionality and resilience, because if we are to deliver offshore wind at scale and meet the government's renewable energy targets, there just simply aren't enough like-for-like measures available. Ideally, we need to have an agreed set of principles to assess and implement and measure different requirements so that measure can deliver outcomes to satisfy more than one regulatory environment. So whilst a strategic approach is challenging, especially given the regulatory framework and the context that we're working under, it's really essential. And there's an urgency to find a path to ensure that we can meet both renewable and biodiversity targets. And definitely having a joined up system would deliver the best outcomes for climate and nature. So yeah, thank you very much for having me, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Lena. And if I could ask the other two speakers, please, to come to the stage. And hopefully in a couple of seconds, we'll have a big queue with the microphone. Please do queue up. And I'll also be watching at the back for any online questions as well. So I'll just mention that online people, you're obviously very welcome to ask questions. If you could please pop them in the Q&A, then they will be picked up as we progress. So, oh, wow, this is impressive. Please come to the microphone.
I'm Ben Williams from RWE, so another developer. I just think, I'd say, Lenny, I think you summed up really well the landscape that we're in, the ambitions and the aspirations we've got as an industry, but the difficulties also that we have to navigate. And it comes back to your targets, Colin, they won't be delivered if we can't do that. So the question I've got, and it's to Audrey, it's something that wasn't mentioned by Ørsted, is there are additional
problems as well. We're seeing requirement for positive environmental outcomes from in the leasing process as well. So we're seeing Crown Estate and other representatives in the room from that organisation as well, also requiring positive environmental actions on developers. So my question is, how well are you all working together? Because if we're getting marine net gain from you, we're getting positive from requirements from Crown Estate during the leasing process, we're seeing non-price factors in other elements of development as well. We've already said how hard this is. If all the opportunities, if we've been asked to do this in all different areas, are you working together to make sure that you don't actually make it impossible for us to build out wind farms like we all want to? Thanks.
Thank you. So I guess just to stress, it's how Marine is advising the government, so it definitely isn't our thing. We are on the more on the pilots project, maybe than on the assessment framework project, very much working with sort of Crown Estate in particular about how you might deliver that. I don't want to talk for the Crown Estate, but I would assume that sort of the nature positive requirements would dovetail into the marine net gain requirements necessarily being completely separate, but that's something we need to work on, I guess, in terms of how that works in that space. But yeah, definitely the intended outcome is to get better recovery for the marine environment, not to make it really difficult to build development.
I can't, we're not allowed to talk of things in detail because we're bound by NDA in terms of processes and things like that. But the impression we've got is that they are additional to each other rather than replacing each other or working together at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And next, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So Susan Governick from the University of Southampton. So I think mostly to Audrey and Anna, but very keen to know what Eleni thinks too. So I'm interested to know to what extent or the intention is that marine net gain and strategic compensation are applicable to all the other users of the ocean, and indeed to sectors whose activities influence the health of the ocean. There's a lot of talk about, delivering offshore wind at scale, which I think has many challenges, but in terms of ocean use, there are many industrial activities at much greater scale than offshore wind is going to even account for come 2050. And the sort of second part of the question is, do you think that offsetting the carbon emissions that would otherwise be created if there was no offshore wind is a reasonable strategic compensation or marine net gain?
Do you want me to go first, Anna? So I guess to say that compensation and marine net gain does apply to all development sectors. I guess offshore wind is the one that everyone's talking about because they are the first ones that have triggered it properly in the marine environment for compensation. So I guess that's where the focus is around that. But marine net gain will apply to everything that is licensed under a sort of a development license. So fishing, no, because that doesn't come under a marine license process. But in the principles that DEFRA published at the end of 2023, I think it talks about sort of potentially the removal of pressure, which I guess then relates to sort of potential removal of fishing pressure, could be considered as interventions to deliver marine net gain. But because they don't fall into that consenting process, and they've got quite a lot of regulation, I guess, to comply with in terms to make them sort of environmentally sustainable, they're not in that frame at the moment. And second part of your question, I think that's very much a policy question, DEFRA, and I won't point it to Vic, but I think they are definitely looking at all options, but I guess it's meant to be ecological gain at the moment. So trying to relate sort of offsets of carbon to ecological gain. I don't know how certain you could be in a regulatory framework to do that.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Like the Marine Recovery Fund at the moment is the plan is to set that up for offshore wind. I think that's a good starting point. I don't think that's how it should work. I think everyone who is working or constructing or doing anything in the marine environment, the same sort of onus should be on them to compensate for any impacts as it is on offshore wind. And therefore, if that could all be facilitated through one fund, why wouldn't you do that? That makes much more sense to me because again, it's about trying to, I think, deliver those things that will actually really work. So it shouldn't just be, I don't know if you think you need it all, but for me, they should be applicable to lots of different industries, not just the offshore wind industry. I think it's just because of the focus at the moment of really pushing out offshore wind, it's being looked at, but I certainly don't think that's how it should work. I don't know if I have too much to say about carbon. Do you have anything on that? No, put you on the spot. Yeah, I guess, yeah, we're more focused on the ecological stuff at the moment rather than carbon, but it's all interesting, isn't it, in the mix?
Sure.
So thank you very much. And I agree. And I understand that everyone has to operate in this existing sort of regulatory framework and perhaps within some of these sector silos. But it strikes me that it's a bit like, you know, having a requirement to build like a carbon neutral and like, you know, very environmentally friendly school and then sticking it on a ring road, allowing all of their, you know, HGV vehicles to like chug out fumes around them. And so that perhaps, you know, if we could take a step back and assess all of these different ocean uses, not all, but they just don't like, they don't have to comply with this or that. That could, you know, actually provide some marine net gain rather than sort of the document that is marine net gain. But thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And yes, thank you.
Hello, I'm Michela De Dominicis from the National Oceanography Center. Actually, my question is similar to her second question. So I have the impression that when we are assessing ecological losses and gains, sometimes we are missing the bigger picture. And maybe not, but this is my impression, because when we are deploying offshore wind farms, we are already offsetting climate change. And that's already a massive gain. So when you are talking about strategic compensation or marine net gain, the fact that we are offsetting climate change doesn't come into play?
I think, as we were just saying, we're working under the regulatory frameworks and we want to move towards a strategic approach so that we can have that bigger picture thinking, because when you are working on the regulations, you're focusing on very specific details. So then that bigger picture doesn't necessarily come in. I don't know if you have anything.
No, I think just echoing what was said before, I guess, and I do take your point, but I guess it's very much about that ecological biodiversity crisis. I guess that marine net gain side of things. I take your point, obviously climate change is happening and that's going to impact on those species, but I don't think there's a framework in place to make that connection at the moment, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't happen in the future. It's very, very early days for marine net gain, so yeah.
About carbon and things like this, I mean, just focusing on the ecological losses and gains. I mean, maybe a bird is going to die anyway because of climate change and not because of collision with an offshore wind farm. Just, yeah.
Yeah, I just add as well, I think that's why it's really important that we look at biodiversity and climate together, because we've got a dual crisis, biodiversity loss and climate change, and they're intrinsically interlinked. So we need to be looking at them together and they can both help each other.
That's just what I was about to say, but it was a great point, well made. You know, I would just echo that. I think I think that we shouldn't lose focus on is it shouldn't be development at any cost. And I think there is a balance between, we definitely need offshore wind and renewables just generally, but we are in a biodiversity crisis. The marine system is already in quite a bad, degraded state. And I don't think any of the developers in this room or anywhere want to add to that if they can help it. So I think that having regard to the ecological impacts is still important, even though, yes, we need it from a carbon and climate point of view. So I think it's just that balance.
Thank you very much. Before going to Beth, we have an online question. So toward the back, please.
This from AIM. We are talking about very different scales. GES is assessed at a very large scale, while project level assessments address very local scales. What are the chances of the latter influencing the former outside of natural variability levels?
Thank you. So different scales, which is actually a question I've also got written down here. So who would like to tackle that thorny issue first, if we're going to link it to GES?
I think it's, yeah.
Thank you, Alejandro. That is a very, very pertinent question. And that's something that we're very much now looking into as part of the Marine Net Gain Assessment Framework project. How can you make that work in practice? And I guess it's thinking back to the tools that Will and Alex talked about in the first talk, like can we use those to help us understand the project level impacts on GES descriptors? So yes, we need to test whether that can work at the moment. But I guess with Marine Net Gain, trying to work out how you can do it in a fair and transparent way that links it to the ecological losses and delivers gains in a meaningful way without sort of reinventing the wheel. So I guess that's where we got to with the GES. But yes, we need to test if it's possible and whether it's the route we definitely want to go down.
Thank you. Other responses?
I guess just in terms of scales, I think when we're looking at a strategic approach, that's maybe where we need to have broader scale monitoring and research being done, which we're already starting to see, which is great. So hopefully that will help address the variety of different scales needed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have loads to add. I think it just as well, maybe links back to some of the strategic monitoring that was discussed earlier, because hopefully that will enable even, you know, individual projects to be looking at a slightly different scale. So assessing, you know, what their impacts mean in the broader context of the UK or whatever the appropriate scale is at that point. So I think there is already quite a lot of work happening to try and monitor and assess things in a more strategic manner. And I think that should just be encouraged. And I think that's what the developers want to do. It makes more sense, you know, it's probably more cost effective as well as providing more information at a broader scale.
I don't know if Alejandro maybe had a supplementary question, but maybe I can jump in with a supplementary question. Sorry, Beth, we'll get to you in a second. But clearly, there is a cause and effect relationship as well. And as was shown yesterday, both the Celtic Sea and the North Sea are already in a degraded state and probably not at GES in a number of indicators. So what is the challenge, or what do you think is the key challenge in terms of being able to identify improvements in GES when there are other things that are impacting the same indicators?
I guess that's where we're trying to go back to those first principles. So looking at the programme of measures for delivery of GES and understanding where they're failing and where they're not sufficient, and then turning that into that wider strategic restoration plan, which is much wider than just MNG. That's looking at what do we need to do, which I guess would then be taking account of all those other impacts on it as well. And then from that, you can sort of work out your regional programme of measures. And again, that's understanding the contribution that MNG can make to that, and recognise there's other marine management and other things going on in that space. And I guess I'm thinking around linking it back to GES as well, is that measurably better state? We know that it's very, very difficult to measure things in the marine environment in the terms that you're guaranteed that you know what the outcome is. So if you're in a sort of direction of travel in GES, that helps to bring that feedback loop and give you sort of greater certainty on whether you're in a positive or negative trend.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments?
I think it's interesting you mentioned that areas are already in a degraded state, and I think that's why we need, by moving towards a non-like for like approach, we can address that maybe as a starting point before we even go into those very, very specific measures that we're also seeing being developed as well. So I think there's a much wider opportunity here.
Yeah, this is just a personal feeling of mine, but maybe the right time to bring it up. But I think it's potentially a good time to bring a debate about our designations as well. Lots of the designations were put in place when the environment was already degraded. And I would challenge that what we're trying to work towards isn't ambitious enough. We should be looking to restore our marine environment to the time before that, when it was actually a beautiful, heterogeneous, multi-functioning, wonderful habitat. I think we're almost slightly restricted with the compensation we can provide because of the like for like that's in place at the moment. But I think it's a really good time maybe to open the debate about being more ambitious with what we're trying to work towards, because I think that would actually open up and enable more measures to be delivered through offshore wind or through whomever's working in the marine environment, and we'd restore our marine space. And why wouldn't we want to do that? So I know it's a bit controversial, but let's try and aim higher, I would say.
Thank you very much. And Beth, thank you for waiting so patiently there.
No worries. Beth Scott from the University of Aberdeen, the PI of Pelagio in the ECOWind program. My question is, then a lot of the outcomes that are coming out of the ECOWind program, one of them being that the wind farms themselves are changing the environment, possibly for good, possibly not for good, maybe very dependent on where they're put. How about wind farms themselves, the output, say it's positive. You are increasing good plankton at the right time of year. So it's going to increase fish growth. And it's actually going to help with some of the predator-prey interactions. Can that effect of wind farms itself, done in the right spatial scale, can that itself be thought about as compensation? And just before, also then the scale issue comes up. What scale should that be thought of? What is a region? Where would it make sense where, especially a lot of the oceanographic effects of multiple farms together are actually becoming cumulative and need to be thought of together? And can the actual then identification of what those changes are and that increase in understanding be compensation?
It's a very good question. I think potentially, I think we're in a situation now where we've got quite a lot of wind farms up and running, but we're putting a lot more out there. And I think for me, as the evidence increases, where we can get more certainty about what those impacts are, benefit, and good and bad, then that will allow you to, I think, to have those conversations about, okay, well, you are having this net positive if you are, and therefore, can that be classed as some of what you need to do as your compensation? I think a lot of that is about, and equally, the compensation measures that are being put in, are we doing too much because they're based on over precautionary methods during the impact assessment, in which case, can you then use those, you've almost banked them, and then does that enable stuff to happen? I think there's a whole conversation that needs to be had about how that's going to work going forward, because it might be that we're overcompensating, it might be that we're undercompensating. And so if you're undercompensating, I'm pretty sure you'd be expected to do more. And so for me, it should potentially work both ways. And I think a lot of it will just be about getting that knowledge, I think. And obviously the work you guys are doing is really useful for that. And once there's more certainty, then I think it's a conversation to be had.
Yeah, I think thank you for raising it, because it's a really important consideration, and we do need to look at things more holistically and look at that bigger picture. And if there are positives as well, then that needs to be taken into consideration when we're measuring the baseline and considering what might be needed in terms of marine net gain and compensation. So yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, I think in DEFRA's response to the principles, they have said that it's sort of incidental environmental benefits, which I guess is maybe a bit more in talking about that, but I guess that's how you class it, could be taken into account as marine net gain measures. And definitely, I think cumulative impacts has got to be a massive, massive factor in this, whether that's benefits or impacts. And I think that's why I think our recommendations would be that things should be done at that much more strategic regional level. I guess on your question around regional, it's difficult, isn't it? Because obviously the biological regional doesn't necessarily make sense from an administrative regional perspective. And I guess there's going to be that balance between what fits from a marine ecosystem perspective and then what fits from what you can actually deliver on the ground from a realistic perspective. So it might end up being regional from a marine plan area as opposed to what you might think from an ecosystem level, which will be a challenge.
Thank you very much. At this stage, I'd like to go back online. We have another question.
In the first talk, we heard that ecosystem functionality and dynamics are too complex to be compensated for by another ecosystem. How do you keep this in mind when compensating for offshore wind farms in marine protected areas?
Okay, who would like to take that challenge?
Like sort of argument, and I guess that where the Eleni and Anna sort of talked about in terms of restrictions around the legislation. So I think with marine net gain, we've got a much more opportunity, and I guess that's why I was trying to link it back to the GES descriptors as well. So it allows you to have that greater scope to deliver things for the ecosystem. So if you're impacting on one descriptor, you don't necessarily have to marine net gain for that descriptor. You're looking at wider ecosystem processes, hence the starting to say that's what we're trying to move to. Our recommendation would be to move to for marine net gain. Whereas for compensation, the way the current legislation is set up, it is very much that like for like. And I guess DEFRA is looking at sort of changes to that at the moment, but until that's in place, that is how the legislation is set up. So that's how it needs to be delivered in marine protected areas.
I think you've covered it. Audrey?
Yeah, no, I don't.
Okay, thank you very much. Please.
Vladimir Krivtsov, Strathclyde University and ECOWind projects. My question in the first instance is to Audrey, but hopefully will be relevant to other members of the panel. In particular, I think Orsted may like to comment. So it just, could I check my understanding regarding the scope and the system boundaries? In the presentation, it was stated that marine net gain will be specifically considered for the subtidal environment. I was just wondering whether that means the intertidal zone is explicitly excluded. That habitat is, of course, very important in many respects, in particular, for instance, for invertebrate biodiversity, which then provides important grounds for wading birds. And furthermore, seagrass was mentioned. So next to Edinburgh in Aberfeldy Bay mudfloods, at least 2 species of Zostera are growing. Does it mean that in this environment, similar habitats would be excluded? And just a final observation in the Orsted presentation, of course, the compensatory measure for Rhizotrudactyla for kittiwakes was, well, appeared to be built on a sandbank. So I just was wondering if you could clarify in that regard, please.
So I guess marine net gain, it comes down to that legislative boundaries, which doesn't necessarily reflect always what happens in reality. So the intertidal area is currently covered by biodiversity net gain, which is a more sort of terrestrial equivalent, which goes down to marine low water mark. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel in that space with marine net gain, but under the pilots project, one of the key things we're looking at is that interface, and to make sure we don't sort of produce something which has perverse outcomes that we don't want to see, and to make sure that they do interact together. So definitely the intertidal area is not being excluded. It's just already included under an existing regulatory mechanism, which doesn't need a new assessment framework at the moment. I'll hand over to Eleni.
So was your question about where the nesting structure was built? Was that your question?
A possible inconsistency.
Yeah, so it wasn't on a sandbank, it was near one. It was in the nearshore area off the coast of East Suffolk. And yeah, we went through a very lengthy process to select those locations. And it was also subject to its own marine licence application, so environmental impact. Well, not for the EIA, but environmental assessments and things as well.
Right, but it wasn't in the subtidal area. It was on the sand, was it?
I will come back to you with the exact water depth, but it's about 1 kilometre from the shore. So,
all right, sorry.
Yeah.
It appeared on the illustration, even though it was sand. I do apologize. I did say it may not have been.
No, I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, please. Thank you.
Hi, Will Kane from CFAS. Now, I have to admit, I'm not fully comprehend all of this world that's opening up for us. So it's a kind of connected point, but apologies if I am confused and you can put me right. And it's related to additionality and to pressures. So the point about additionality is my understanding is for a lot of compensation schemes, you have to demonstrate that what you're doing is additional to what should be happening anyway. And bearing in mind, we have a full set of environmental targets we're not necessarily yet meeting. Are we expecting any of these compensation measures to be additional to what we should be achieving? And related to that with pressures, there are a lot of existing pressures still affecting the marine environment, fishing, land-based sources of pollution from farming, industry and sewage. Now, if you'd left the taps on and your bath was overflowing, it seemed a little foolhardy to start mopping the floor while the taps are still running. So when you were looking at I forget which of the presentations was talking about some of the measures, they seem to be more about rehabilitation rather than managing pressures, such as looking at supporting changes in farming or fishing practices, or even supporting improvements in sewage treatment. So I was just wondering, this feels to my mind a kind of interrelationship there between managing pressures and additionality, and what is the expectations here?
Very good questions. I'll try and cut them down. So additionality, I think that's really interesting. I think there's lots of conversation going on about what is additional and what is standard management on a site and what is actually happening and what's not, and therefore what can you class as additional. I think it's something that we could do with having a more open conversation about, because I think in reality a lot of what should be happening isn't. And so at the moment we're stuck in this position where potentially developers can't fund it. Should they? That's a question. But our environment's not improving, and that doesn't seem like that's a win for anybody, in my opinion. Out of interest, I think one of the predator reduction sites over on the Suffolk coast, I think there was a challenge to that when that went through the derogation process, that it wasn't additional because part of the site management was around predator reduction. The Secretary of State finding on that was that that level of money wouldn't have been put into that site in the same timescale. So they classed that it was additional to normal site management. It's a really tricky one. Yeah, as I said, I think it's really, really hard. I think we're all trying to get our marine and all of our environment to improve, and the best way of doing that is a tricky one around additionality, and yeah, it raises questions about who is responsible and who's doing what and where there's money, I think. The second part, which I've then forgotten, was about
kind of managing pressures, sort of supporting other sectors which maybe should be doing things already which aren't.
I think it's an interesting one. I know DEFRA have been, shouldn't really talk for them, but I know they've been looking at some of the main pressures on the marine environment and how they could be reduced. And I think that's a really interesting piece of work. Through the Strategic Compensation Studies project, what we're trying to focus on is measures that can be delivered maybe by developers directly if they needed to, rather than maybe government-led ones. So the MPA designations. So some of the ones around farming and what isn't allowed, maybe they're more water companies. That would be hardest for some of the developers to deliver themselves, or to even pull together and deliver. Maybe you could pay farmers to do it, but then again, it's just how do you quantify that? And if it's all about how do you link it back to what the impacts are, or is how do you say that's okay as a non-like for like measure? And I think we all know with the water environment, getting one farmer to change something isn't, we need it on a catchment scale. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I probably just waffled through that, but I don't know if that was useful.
Yes, thank you.
I think I'd just add on the point of additionality, that it's something that's much debated, let's say, and I think we need clarity on how additionality is defined. And then also, if we are wanting to move towards a much more flexible and holistic approach, can there be some aspects that are not additional that are still funded because they're having wider benefit and because they're a really high priority for the marine environment, as well as doing other things as well? So yeah, it's really a question.
I think that's, you've hit the nail on the head. I think this is where marine net gain maybe comes in more than compensation. Compensation is very restricted and it has got that additionality question. I think how additionality applies to marine net gain is something that's still being looked at. But if we're going to go and do these interventions, if you're going to plant seagrass or oysters, you need to address those other things like water quality and other pressures. Otherwise, it's all a bit pointless. So I think the interventions that could be done for marine net gain are still being considered, but I think that wider stuff needs to be played in there. Otherwise, it's all not going to work out.
Thank you very much. And I don't know how many of you listened to any questions, but we're getting up against time. So if we could invite the last question, if you could ask the panel, please, to give maybe a one-sentence answer if that's possible.
Hopefully try, well, not answer, but give a answer. So something. So this was a really, really interesting session to listen to. And there's policy colleagues in DEFRA that are online listening in, and that's why I've got my phone here. So I just wanted to say that, as I mentioned before, that we don't have a policy update to give you right now around all of this. And this is, if you go back to my Venn diagram, the politics circle at the beginning is quite big at the moment. So our policy teams have worked really hard with our ministers and they're briefed, and so we're just awaiting on directions, and we're really hopefully going to be able to come out with directions on a direction very soon. With the marine recovery policy, we do intend to consult on the marine recovery policy, and it is expecting it imminently, so it will be in the next few months. I know it originally said autumn 2024, but then is it a definite autumn? Sometimes we can stretch that out a little bit, but as I say, we're still awaiting direction from the Minister. The statutory instrument and the business case will then follow, and the Marine Recovery Fund we're still expecting it to become operational from autumn 2025. And also with regards to some of the really meaty, juicy questions that came in, I'm sure people within the industry, and also Audrey, you have your policy contacts already directly in DEFRA, so you can get in touch with them. But we also have a general offshore wind mailbox. So if people here that have some of their juicy questions and they would like to ask DEFRA, because it wasn't just for offshore wind, there was marine spatial prioritisation questions, marine net gain questions, UKMS questions. So we do have a mailbox which we can share.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, can I first of all thank our speakers again. And can I thank all our colleagues for their excellent questions, and also to those of you who are online, thank you very much also for putting in the questions. As the chair of the Programme Advisory Group for ECOWind and ECOFlow, can I just thank everybody on behalf of the Programme Advisory Group for all the fantastic presentations, for the discussions that's happened today. I certainly have enjoyed the last day and a half, and at this stage now, I'd like to hand over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Paul, would you mind putting up the QR code for the survey, please? Thank you. So, colleagues, you stand between yourselves and lunch. So for the next 2 minutes, I'm going to stand here completely silently while you complete that survey. These events are expensive to run, to set up. You've all had travel costs. We need them to be the best they can every single time. So you have 2 minutes. I would be hugely grateful if you could do that survey now. Thank you. Right, I am now. Thank you. You've not quite done it. Hugely grateful if you did just over lunch. Thank you. Okay, so closing thoughts and reflections. I'm not going to sum up to excellent sessions, which are very recent in all our minds. I want to thank everybody for their contributions, however you've contributed. You've been a speaker, you've chaired, you've been here in the room, you've been online, you've asked questions. You've had conversations in the margins. Thank you so much, everybody, for making this a great meeting. There's a huge amount to take away for all of us, and it's going to be a fascinating few months as we process this in order to have the best impact we can with this fantastic science. I thank the venue team and this amazing, I mean, the acoustics in this place are amazing. It has been a little chill, but the amazing venue and the venue team. Thank you to Mindfully Wired colleagues. Thank you to the HMC Champions team, who it's a privilege to lead. Thank you to Colin for sharing the burden of Dickon not being here with me, and it's a pleasure to be working with you again, Colin. It's been a good few years. So lunch is now until 1:25. If you could have your posters down by 1:25, please, that would be fantastic. There are 2 closed sessions then this afternoon. They'll start around 1:30, if that's okay. If you've been invited to it, if you know you're at a closed session, you're going to it. If you're not, flee, head home. There'll be one in here with lead scientists, which Hank, and I'm enormously grateful to Esther Jones, who's stepping in to chair it from BIOS this afternoon. That's looking at continuing our journey from the science through policy and out forward through to impact. And the other session will be it's not going to be where the posters are because frankly, that is unbearably cold. So we're going to gather, the PIs, Colin and I, going to gather in somewhere in the cafe that's a little bit warmer for our meeting again, just after 1:30. Have safe journeys home. The reason Esther is standing in is the colleague we were bringing from Dorset to chair didn't make it out of their village today. So I think if you are heading west, you may wish to check your travel plans, but have safe journeys home. Paul, have I missed anything? Have I missed anybody? If I've missed you, my apologies. Thank you so much, everybody, for a great 2 days, and have a safe journey, and we will see you soon. Thank you.